My husband introduced me to his boss as just my side chick at 8:47 p.m. on a Friday in October, in front of 211 people, while I was holding a glass of Cristal that cost the company $11 a sip. I smiled. I shook the man's hand. His name was Richard Halden. He ran a $400 million capital firm, and he had no idea that in 40 minutes, a host would take the microphone and announce that the keynote speaker and newest majority shareholder of Halden Bishop Capital was me. Elena Reyes, if you have ever had to smile through public humiliation while sitting on a secret worth $212 million, comment the city you're watching from right now. And if you like your revenge cold, documented, and legally airtight, like this video and subscribe. Because in the next 11 minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly how I ended 4 careers, 1 marriage, and 1 very expensive family delusion in a single night. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand 3 things that were happening at the exact same time, all of them hidden from each other, all of them about to collide under one roof. The first thing was money. 18 months before that gala, I had discovered a hole in the books of Halden Bishop Capital that started at $400,000 and, by the time I finished tracing it, ended at $11.6 million. My husband, Marcus Hale, was the vice president of client development there. He didn't know I knew. He didn't know what I did for a living, not really, not the actual mechanics of it, because I had spent 6 years letting him believe I did boring compliance paperwork for a mid-size firm downtown, when in reality I was the managing partner of Reyes Forensic Advisory, a due diligence practice my father had built and handed to me, the kind of firm that private equity funds call when they smell something rotten in a target company's ledgers before they sign a 9-figure check. That was Loop A, the fraud. The number that kept growing every time I pulled a new bank statement, and the man closest to it was living in my house, sleeping in my bed, and drawing a salary from the very account I was quietly tracing back to a shell company, registered in Delaware, under the name Hartwell Logistics Solutions, LLC. The second thing was betrayal, and it had a name. Brianna Cole, 31 years old, director of client relations at the same firm, 5'9", always in Alexander McQueen, always laughing a half-second too long at whatever Marcus said in a room full of people. That was Loop B. I found the first hotel charge on a card I wasn't supposed to have access to 9 months into the affair, though I wouldn't know it was 9 months until much later, when I finally pieced together the timeline from keycard logs a private investigator pulled for me. $480 at the Langham on a Tuesday in February, a date Marcus told me he was in Chicago, closing a deal with a nervous client. There was no client. There was no Chicago. There was a suite on the 11th floor and a woman who worked 20 feet from his office 5 days a week. The third thing was the plan, and that was Loop C, the part I'm not going to explain yet, except to say this. My father, Julian Reyes, built Reyes Capital Group from nothing into a $2.1 billion holding company over 31 years, and 6 weeks before that gala, his firm quietly closed on 51% of Halden Bishop Capital. Nobody at Halden Bishop knew who Reyes Capital Group actually was behind the paperwork, because my father structured the acquisition through a subsidiary called Meridian Crest Holdings, and because the woman signing as authorized representative used her maiden name, a name none of Marcus's colleagues had ever heard, because to them I was simply Marcus's wife, the quiet one, the one who showed up to company holiday parties in tasteful navy dresses and left before dessert. I need you to sit with that for a second, because it matters for everything that comes after. I was, by that October evening, the majority owner of the company my husband worked for, the company that employed the woman he was sleeping with, and the company whose books contained an $11.6 million hole that I had already traced, documented, and handed to federal investigators 4 days earlier. And my husband stood in front of his boss and called me his side chick, as a joke, to impress a man he was trying to get a promotion from, because in Marcus's mind, the wife who did paperwork wasn't glamorous enough to be introduced as a wife to a man he wanted to impress. He thought it was funny. Richard Halden actually laughed, a short, uncomfortable bark, and looked at me like he was waiting for me to laugh too. So I did. I laughed. I have a very good laugh when I need one. My father taught me that a controlled face is worth more than any legal document, because people underestimate a woman who's still smiling. But I'm getting ahead of the timeline, and if I don't give you the full picture, none of what happens at that gala is going to land the way it needs to. So let's go back 9 years. To the beginning, to the version of Marcus Hale I actually married, and the version of this family that convinced me, for far too long, that I was the lucky one. I met Marcus at a fundraiser in the Hamptons, the summer I turned 25. I was 3 years into building my career at a smaller forensic accounting shop, still cutting my teeth on divorce audits and small business fraud cases. Nothing like the scale I work at now. Marcus was 29, tall, tanned in a way that suggested a boat rather than a beach. And he had this trick where he'd ask you a question and then actually listen to the answer, which, if you've ever dated in finance circles, you know is rarer than it should be. His family had a name. Not old money exactly, but old enough. The Hales had run a regional investment bank in Connecticut for 2 generations before it got swallowed by a larger firm in the 90s. And what was left was a family that still spoke and dressed and vacationed like the money was there, even after most of it wasn't. His mother, Vivian Hale, 63 at the time we married, was the kind of woman who could compliment your dress and make you feel poorly dressed in the same sentence. She had a particular gift for reminding people, gently, constantly, of what the Hale name used to mean, as though the family's actual net worth were a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent condition. The first time she met me at a dinner Marcus arranged at a restaurant in Greenwich, she looked at my watch, a simple steel Cartier my father had given me for graduating with my CPA, and said, "Oh, that's a lovely little starter watch," in a tone that made it very clear she'd priced it in her head and found it wanting. I remember laughing it off in the moment because Marcus squeezed my hand under the table and mouthed, "Ignore her," and because I genuinely, foolishly thought that kind of comment was a one-time thing, a nervous mother sizing up her son's girlfriend. It was not a one-time thing. It was the entire operating system of that family, and I spent the better part of a decade mistaking its consistency for honesty, when really it was just a trait, worn so smooth from repetition that nobody in the family even noticed they were doing it anymore. Marcus's younger brother, Tyler Hale, 29 when we married and 38 the night of the gala, had never held a job longer than 14 months in his adult life, a fact the family discussed the way other families discuss a relative's ongoing battle with a chronic but not fatal illness, with concern, with excuses, with an unshakable belief that the next opportunity would finally be the one that stuck. Tyler had tried real estate, failed, tried a consulting practice that consisted of one client, his father, for 11 months, tried most recently something he called brand strategy, that as far as I could tell involved posting on LinkedIn about leadership 4 times a week and asking Marcus for $4,000 every time his card got declined at a restaurant. Tyler's fixed trait, the one thing about him that never once wavered in 9 years, was that somebody else was always supposed to pay, and he never once seemed embarrassed about it, because in his mind, being a Hale was itself a kind of employment. Marcus's sister, Chloe Hale Bennett, 34 at the time of the gala, married into slightly more money than the Hales had left, to a man named Douglas Bennett who worked in commercial insurance and mostly stayed out of family drama. Smart man. Chloe's fixed trait was laziness dressed up as delegation. She had a way of assigning tasks to other people in the family with total confidence that this was itself a form of labor. She organized exactly one family event a year, Christmas Eve, and by organized, I mean she sent a group text 3 weeks out asking who was handling the turkey, the wine, the seating chart, the gifts for the staff at the country club where they held it, and then took full credit at the actual event for how smoothly everything ran. Usually with a toast that included the phrase, "I just wanted to make sure everyone felt taken care of this year," while Vivian nodded approvingly, and I stood there having personally paid for and arranged 4 of the 6 things she just claimed credit for organizing. And then there was Brianna Cole, who I didn't meet as the woman my husband is sleeping with. Nobody meets anyone that way. That's not how it works. I met her as a colleague of Marcus's at a company barbecue 3 years into their working together, before, as far as I know, anything had started between them. She had a laugh that carried across a room and a habit of touching people's forearms when she talked to them, men and women both, though I'd notice years later, looking back through old photos with the particular cruelty of hindsight, that she touched Marcus's forearm slightly longer than she touched anyone else's. Her fixed trait, the one I'd come to know with total clarity by the time this story reaches its climax, was arrogance dressed as confidence, a bone-deep certainty that she was owed things other people had to work for, that her looks and her charm were themselves a form of currency that should exempt her from consequences. I didn't know any of that yet, standing at a barbecue in my early 30s, watching my husband laugh at something she said. I just filed her away as Marcus's coworker Brianna, the way you file away dozens of names in your spouse's professional orbit, never imagining you'll need to remember the exact shade of her laugh 5 years later when a private investigator hands you a folder of hotel receipts. I want to be honest about something, because this isn't a story where I present myself as a woman who saw everything coming and simply waited, patient and cold, for the pieces to fall into place. That's not what happened. What happened is that for years, I was genuinely, completely absorbed in building Reyes Forensic Advisory into something real, something separate from my father's shadow, taking on smaller clients at first, then bigger ones, working the kind of hours that meant I genuinely didn't have the bandwidth to interrogate every small inconsistency in my own marriage. Marcus's late nights closing deals folded easily into my own late nights reconciling ledgers for clients who needed answers by Monday morning. We were, from the outside, a power couple too busy to notice each other clearly, and I think that busyness was doing a lot of quiet work for both of us. For me, it was genuine. For him, I'd later learn, it was cover. The turn, the actual beginning of what you're watching unfold in this video, started with something almost embarrassingly mundane, a credit card statement. It was a Tuesday night, 11:40, and I was doing what I always did before bed, which was a quick pass through our joint account statements, not out of suspicion but out of habit, the same habit that had made me good at my job in the first place. I noticed a recurring wire, $8,000 a month, going out to an entity called Hartwell Logistics Solutions LLC, tagged in our own household budgeting software under Marcus, Business Reimbursement, a category he'd created himself 11 months earlier. 8,000 a month is the kind of number that hides well. It's not so large that it triggers an alert, not so small that anyone would bother investigating it themselves. It's the number a very specific kind of person chooses when they've read enough about how fraud detection actually works to stay just under the line. I didn't think affair when I saw it. I thought, professionally, out of pure reflex, that's a shell. I want to explain, briefly, what I actually do for a living, because it matters for how precisely I was able to take this apart. Forensic accounting isn't detective work in the way movies make it look. It's pattern recognition applied to boring documents, over and over, until the boring documents stop agreeing with each other. A legitimate business reimbursement has an invoice. It has a service description. It has a counterparty you can call and ask, "What did you do for this $8,000?" and get an answer that makes sense within 4 seconds. I ran Hartwell Logistics Solutions LLC through the Delaware Secretary of State's registry the next morning, using my firm's paid access to registered agent records, something a casual spouse checking on a hunch would never have access to, but that I use 40 times a week for actual clients. Hartwell Logistics Solutions LLC had been incorporated 14 months earlier. Its registered agent was a formation service in Wilmington that specialized in setting up shell entities for $50 and total anonymity. Its listed manager was a name I didn't recognize at first, R. Okonkwo Hale. It took me 4 full minutes, sitting at my own kitchen island at 6 in the morning with my coffee going cold, to realize that R. Okonkwo Hale was a reference to Ridgeview, the street Marcus grew up on in Greenwich, combined with his mother's maiden name, Okonkwo, a name Vivian rarely used but that appeared on her original passport. He had built the fake identity out of pieces of his own childhood, which told me 2 things immediately. This was not something he'd been coached into by a professional, and this was not something he'd done casually. He'd thought about it. He'd built it like a person building a hiding place they intended to use for years. I didn't confront him. I want to be very clear about why, because I know some of you watching are already yelling at your screen asking why I didn't just sit him down that Tuesday night and demand an explanation. Here's why. The moment you confront someone who's hiding something, you give them the single most valuable resource they need to keep hiding it, which is time. Time to shred documents, time to move funds, time to get their story straight, coordinate it with anyone else involved, and start covering tracks that, up until that point, they hadn't even known needed covering, because they didn't know I was looking. My father taught me this when I was 26 years old, working my first big case, a franchise owner skimming from 41 locations. Elena, the amateur, wants to catch the person in the act. The professional wants the paper trail to already be unbreakable before the person even knows they're caught. End quote. So I didn't say a word. I opened a case file the way I would for any client, except this client was my own marriage, and I started pulling threads slowly enough that nothing would move. Over the next 4 months, working almost entirely between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., after Marcus was asleep, I traced every dollar that had passed through Hartwell Logistics Solutions LLC. $8,000 a month from our joint account was only the visible layer. Using bank records I could legally access as a joint account holder, plus public records, plus, eventually, a subpoena-adjacent favor from a contact at a regional bank who owed my father from a deal 15 years earlier. I found the deeper structure. Hartwell wasn't just receiving money from our household account. It was receiving money from Halden Bishop Capital itself, disguised as consulting fees for logistics optimization services that, as far as I could determine, consisted of absolutely nothing. No deliverables, no contracts on file with any actual scope of work, no employees, no office, nothing but a mailing address that turned out to be a UPS store on the outskirts of Stamford. The first Halden Bishop payment to Hartwell that I could document was $400,000, wired 18 months before I discovered any of this, disguised in the company's general ledger under a line item called Strategic Vendor Services Q2 Initiative. By the time I finished tracing every wire, every invoice, every altered ledger entry, the total sitting inside Hartwell Logistics Solutions LLC, some of it moved onward into a brokerage account under yet another shell, some of it spent directly. I found charges for a leased Porsche Cayenne registered to Hartwell, charges for a storage unit in Norwalk, charges for the Langham Hotel that I hadn't yet connected to anything personal, came to $11,600,000 in change. $11.6 million, embezzled from Halden Bishop Capital's operating accounts over 18 months, laundered through a shell company built on the bones of my husband's own childhood address and his mother's maiden name, partially funneled back into our joint household account to make our lifestyle look sustainable on his actual salary, which, for the record, was $210,000 a year, respectable, but nowhere close to what was funding the Cayenne, the wine collection he'd started as an investment, or the $12,000 watch he'd bought himself for his 37th birthday and told me was a gift from a grateful client. I sat with that number for 3 days before I did anything else, because a number that large changes the shape of every decision that follows it. This wasn't a spouse quietly padding an expense account. This was federal wire fraud and embezzlement, at a scale that would end in prison time if handled correctly. And handled incorrectly, it could also end with me somehow looking complicit, because I was a joint account holder receiving funds from a shell company whose existence I could, if someone wanted to be uncharitable about it, be accused of having reason to suspect. I needed to move in a way that protected me completely before I moved in a way that exposed him at all. So I called the one person whose judgment I trusted more than my own, in situations exactly like this one, my father. Julian Reyes is 68 years old, built Reyes Capital Group out of a single warehouse acquisition in 1995 into a $2.1 billion holding company, and has spent the better part of 4 decades cultivating a reputation as the single most dangerous man to lie to in 3 different industries. He doesn't raise his voice. I have never once in 34 years of being his daughter heard my father raise his voice. He gets quieter when he's furious, which is somehow so much worse. When I laid the Hartwell file out for him on his dining room table on a Sunday afternoon, page by page, wire by wire, he didn't say anything for almost 6 full minutes. He just turned pages. Then he looked up at me and said 4 words that set the entire second half of this story in motion. "Does Halden know yet?" I said no. Nobody at Halden Bishop Capital knew their VP of Client Development had been quietly bleeding the company for 18 months, because the fraud had been structured specifically to avoid triggering any of the internal controls a company that size would normally have. Marcus knew the controls because he'd helped design part of the vendor approval workflow himself 2 years earlier, back when he was trying to make himself indispensable to Richard Halden. He'd built the fraud using knowledge of the exact gaps he'd created. My father asked one more question. "Do you want to save the marriage, or do you want to be right?" I remember being annoyed by the question at the time, because it felt like it was asking me to choose between 2 things that, in my mind, weren't yet mutually exclusive. I told him I wanted to know everything first and decide after. He nodded, and then he told me something that I didn't fully understand the weight of until 6 weeks later. Halden Bishop's been quietly looking for a capital partner for 8 months. Richard Halden doesn't know it yet, but he's about to need one badly, once this fraud becomes public and his investors start asking where their money went. I can be that partner, and if I am, you'll have every legal tool in the world to fix this the right way, instead of the messy way. That was the moment Loop C was born, though I didn't call it that, obviously. I just knew, sitting at my father's table, that there was a version of this where I stopped being a wife quietly gathering evidence and became something with actual institutional power over the company harboring both my husband's fraud and, though I didn't know it yet, his affair. 6 weeks later, Reyes Capital Group, through its subsidiary Meridian Crest Holdings, opened formal acquisition talks with Halden Bishop Capital's board. Richard Halden, drowning in a liquidity problem he'd been too proud to disclose to his own team, said yes faster than my father expected. The deal was structured to close in 4 months. Marcus never once suspected that the capital partner circling his company, the one HR sent a company-wide memo about 11 weeks before the gala, titled Exciting Growth Opportunities Ahead, was his own father-in-law's firm, because the negotiations were handled entirely by Meridian Crest's deal team, and I made absolutely certain my name appeared nowhere in any document Marcus could plausibly ever see. While the acquisition moved forward on one track, I kept working the fraud case on another, and it was during this exact period, 4 months before the gala, that I found the hotel charges. I found the Langham charge first, $480, February the 11th, a Tuesday. The same week Marcus told me he'd be in Chicago, closing the Ferris account. I called the Chicago office directly, using a pretext I'd used 100 times for actual clients. A simple, friendly, just confirming shipping details for a gift call to the front desk. And the receptionist told me, cheerfully and with absolutely no idea what she was handing me, that nobody named Marcus Hale had checked into their building that week, and that the Ferris account, as far as she knew, had closed 8 months earlier. I sat in my car in the parking garage under my own office for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home that night. I hired a private investigator the following week, a woman named Renata Ford who my firm had used twice before on client cases. Discreet, meticulous, the kind of person who documents everything in a way that would hold up not just emotionally but in a courtroom, which, by that point, I already suspected I was going to need. Renata pulled the Langham's guest logs through channels I won't detail here, cross-referenced them against Marcus's actual travel records, and within 3 weeks handed me a folder that made the picture completely, unbearably clear. 9 hotel stays over 9 months, always coded internally as business travel, always paired with a matching stay by a woman named Brianna Cole, 31, Director of Client Relations at Halden Bishop Capital, the same laughing woman from the company barbecue 3 years earlier, the one who touched people's forearms a half-second too long. Renata also gave me something I hadn't asked for but that turned out to matter enormously later. 7 months of keycard access logs from the Halden Bishop Capital building itself, pulled legally through a records request tied to an unrelated security audit Reyes Capital Group's due diligence team was already running as part of the acquisition process. Marcus and Brianna's badge swipes showed them entering the building's east stairwell together, alone, at least twice a week, always between 6:15 and 6:40 in the evening, long after most of the floor had cleared out, always returning to the main floor 11 to 14 minutes apart, never together. It was almost impressive, the precision of it, the way two people can build an entire second relationship inside the architecture of an ordinary workday, timed down to the minute, hidden in plain sight from 400 coworkers who had no reason to look twice. I didn't confront Marcus about Brianna either, for the same reason I hadn't confronted him about Hartwell, because evidence gathered before confrontation is worth infinitely more than evidence gathered after, and because I now understood I was building not one case but 2, running on parallel tracks, both of which were going to detonate at the same event, on the same night, in front of the same people, if I timed it correctly. But living inside that knowledge for 4 months while continuing to function as Marcus's wife at every family dinner, every company function, every ordinary Tuesday, required a kind of discipline I don't think I fully appreciated until I was doing it. It required watching Vivian Hale needle me over dinner about my little accounting job, while knowing I controlled 51% of the company her son worked for. It required standing next to Tyler while he asked Marcus, in front of me, for another $4,000, just until the brand deal closes, and smiling while I did the math in my head on exactly how many of those loans were actually coming out of stolen Halden Bishop funds Marcus was laundering through our joint account. It required sitting across from Chloe at her Christmas Eve dinner, listening to her toast about how she'd made sure everyone felt taken care of, while I quietly covered the catering bill she'd forwarded to me 2 weeks earlier with a text that just said, "Can you handle this? I'm swamped. No thank you attached. Before or after." I want to give you 3 specific scenes from those 4 months, because I think they matter more than any summary I could give you of, "The family was difficult." Difficult is vague. This wasn't vague. The first scene, a Sunday brunch at Vivian's house in Greenwich, 6 weeks before the gala. Vivian had redone her sunroom, again, at a cost she mentioned twice during the meal. Unprompted, the way she always found a way to mention costs without ever directly asking anyone to acknowledge them. She turned to me partway through the meal and said, in front of Tyler, Chloe, and Douglas, "Elena, you know, I do think it's wonderful that you have your little practice, but have you ever thought about what happens to it once you and Marcus start a family? Someone has to be flexible in a marriage, and it certainly won't be him, not with how well he's doing at Halden Bishop," I said calmly, that I hadn't given it much thought, which was a lie, because at that exact moment I was the majority owner in waiting of the company employing the son she was so proud of, a fact she would not learn for another 6 weeks. And I remember thinking, with a kind of cold clarity that scared me a little, that I could end her entire understanding of the world with one sentence, right there over the Eggs Benedict, and I chose not to, because the timing wasn't right yet, and because I have never once in my life let a satisfying moment override a strategic one. The second scene, 2 weeks later, Tyler called me directly, not Marcus, which he only did when he wanted something and suspected Marcus might say no. He needed $6,000, this time for inventory, related to a skincare brand he was advising, a business that, as far as I could tell from a 10-minute search I did, purely out of professional habit, had 11 followers on Instagram and no LLC registration anywhere in the state. I told him I'd have to check with Marcus, which was also a lie, a stalling tactic, because I already knew, from the Hartwell tracing, that at least 2 of Tyler's previous loans over the prior year had actually come directly out of embezzled Halden Bishop funds that Marcus had routed to him disguised as birthday gifts. Tyler had, without knowing it, been living partly off his brother's fraud for over a year, and I remember hanging up the phone and sitting very still for a long time. Not because I felt sorry for Tyler, but because I understood, in that moment, that the entire financial architecture of this family was built on money none of them had actually earned, sitting on top of a fraud only one person besides Marcus knew existed. The third scene, 3 weeks before the gala, at a company function, I watched Brianna Cole approach Marcus at the bar, place her hand on his forearm exactly the way I now recognized from 4 months of documentation, and lean in to say something that made him laugh, in a way I hadn't heard him laugh at anything I'd said in over a year. She saw me watching from 12 feet away, and instead of looking guilty, she smiled at me. A small, private, satisfied smile, the kind of smile that says, "I know something you don't, and I like it that way," and then turned back to Marcus and kept talking. That smile is the single image from those 4 months that I return to most, because it told me everything about the fixed trait Brianna carried through this entire story. She wasn't just having an affair, she was enjoying the arrogance of doing it in front of me, certain that a woman like me, quiet, boring, in her little accounting job, would never be a threat to anyone. By the time I got home that night, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for the fraud investigation and the affair to resolve themselves on separate timelines. I was going to let both of them detonate at the same event, the one place where Loop C, the acquisition, was already scheduled to become public. The Halden Bishop Capital Founders Gala, 470 guests, the entire senior team, the entire board, Vivian, Tyler, and Chloe all invited as Marcus's family, and Brianna Cole seated, I would later confirm, at table 6, 4 tables away from where Marcus and I would be seated as, on paper, just another VP and his quiet wife. I brought the fraud file to federal investigators 11 days before the gala. Not local police. The amount and the interstate wire structure made this a matter for the FBI's white-collar crimes division, specifically an agent named Daniel Osei, who my firm had worked alongside on 2 prior cases and who took one look at the $11.6 million Hartwell trail and told me, flatly, "This is one of the cleanest embezzlement documentation packages I've seen handed to us by a private party in 4 years." I told him I needed one thing in exchange for full cooperation and complete access to everything my firm had gathered. I needed the timing of any public action to align with a date I would provide. Osei, to his credit, didn't ask why. He'd worked with my father's firm before. He just said, "Give me the date, and give me 48 hours notice before it." And I gave him the date of the gala. 4 days before the event, Osei's team quietly executed the first phase of their investigation. Not an arrest, not yet, but a formal notice to Halden Bishop Capital's outside counsel that the firm was under federal investigation for wire fraud and embezzlement. A notice that, under the terms my father's acquisition team had structured, would only become public knowledge to the broader staff and board on the night of the gala itself, timed to coincide with the acquisition announcement, because Reyes Capital Group's deal terms included a clause requiring full disclosure of any pending legal matters to all shareholders at the moment the deal closed. My father had built the trap without Marcus ever realizing the walls were already up. Before I take you into the night of the gala itself, I need to give you two more scenes, because I promised you the full pattern on Vivian and Chloe, not just Tyler and Brianna, and because these two scenes happened in the final week before the event, when the pressure of everything I was holding was at its absolute peak, and somehow, both women managed to make it worse without knowing a single thing about what was coming. 5 days before the gala, Vivian called me directly to discuss gala logistics, which really meant she wanted to confirm, for the third time, that I understood the seating arrangement and my role in it. "You'll be at the Hale table, obviously," she said, "with Marcus, myself, Tyler, Chloe, and Douglas. And Richard will be at the head table with the board, so you understand you won't really be seated with him this time, dear. It's simply how these things work at Marcus's level." I told her that was completely fine. She continued, unprompted, into a small speech about how important this gala was for Marcus's future at the firm, how Richard had been hinting at a promotion to senior managing director, how the family needed to present well that evening, a phrase she used at least 4 times in a 6-minute call, and how she hoped I would wear something appropriately understated, nothing that draws attention away from Marcus's night. I said, and I remember this clearly because I had to physically bite the inside of my cheek to keep my voice level, "Don't worry, Vivian. I think people are going to be paying attention to exactly the right things that night." She took it as agreement. It was not agreement. It was the single most honest sentence I said to that family in the entire 5 days leading up to the gala, and not one of them heard it correctly. 2 days before the gala, Chloe texted the family group chat, the one she'd created and named Hale Family Fun, asking who was handling the valet tip envelopes for the gala and the coordination of a family photo with the local society photographer she'd arranged. Unpaid, expecting the $400 photographer fee to simply appear covered by someone else, the way it always did. I watched the chat for 11 minutes, watched Tyler go silent, watched Vivian type, "So exciting," without addressing the actual financial question at all. And I finally typed, "I've got it." 3 words I had typed into that group chat more times over 9 years than I could count. And put the $400 on a card without a second thought. Because $400 at that point measured against $11.6 million in documented fraud and a federal investigation 4 days from becoming public, felt almost funny in its smallness, a tiny, familiar weight I was about to set down forever. That's the moment I want to pause on for a second, because I think a lot of you watching know exactly this feeling, the exhaustion of being the responsible one in a family that has quietly, over years, without ever formally deciding to, assigned you the role of the person who handles it. Whatever it is, financially, emotionally, logistically, while everyone else gets to be charming and unbothered and, frankly, a little bit useless, and gets thanked for it anyway, gets toasted for it at Christmas, gets to stand in front of 200 people and take credit for things you quietly paid for. If any part of that landed for you, if you have ever been the one who just handles it in your own family, comment the word "handled" below, because I promise you, what happens in the next part of this video is for every single one of you. And if you haven't hit subscribe yet, do it now, because the next 10 minutes are the reason you clicked on this video in the first place. Now let's go to the night of the gala. The Halden Bishop Capital Founders Gala was held, as it was every year, in the grand ballroom of the Ansett Hotel downtown, a room with 22-foot ceilings, 3 crystal chandeliers original to the building's 1926 construction, and a capacity, according to the fire marshal's posted limit near the north entrance, of 510 people. 471 guests were confirmed that night: board members, senior staff, major clients, spouses, and a small contingent of press covering what everyone in the room believed was simply an anniversary celebration marking the firm's 22nd year in business. Nobody except Richard Halden, my father, and a 5-person deal team on each side knew that the evening's printed program, a cream cardstock booklet with gold foil lettering that every guest found on their chair, had a final page that hadn't existed 48 hours earlier, a page announcing the completion of a strategic capital partnership with Meridian Crest Holdings, effective that night, with a keynote address to follow from our newest board chair. I arrived at 7:15 in a dress I'd chosen with more intention than any piece of clothing I'd bought in years. A deep emerald Roland Mouret, structured, sharp shoulders, nothing understated about it at all, in direct and deliberate contradiction of Vivian's request 5 days earlier. Marcus met me in the lobby, kissed my cheek, told me I looked nice, and then spent the walk from the lobby to the ballroom entrance reviewing, out loud, a list of senior people he needed to make sure to talk to that night. A list that did not include a single sentence asking how I was feeling about anything, which, in retrospect, was entirely on brand for the version of him I'd been quietly documenting for 4 months. We found our table, table 3, exactly where Vivian had specified, with Tyler already seated and working through what I would later learn was his third glass of the firm's $22 a glass Sancerre, Chloe and Douglas beside him. Vivian at the head of the family cluster in a burgundy gown she'd mentioned cost more than I'd like to admit, at least twice on the way to our seats. 4 tables away, at table 6, I saw Brianna Cole in a black dress, laughing with 2 other client relations staff, glancing toward our table exactly once, at Marcus, for exactly as long as it takes to confirm someone is watching you and then look away before anyone notices. At 8:30, Richard Halden began making his rounds of the room before the formal program started, the way hosts of these events always do, working tables in a loose, practiced loop, and when he reached table 3, he shook Marcus's hand warmly, told him, "Big year ahead, Hale." Big year, in the tone of a man dangling a promotion just close enough to smell it, and then turned to me with the polite, slightly blank expression of a man who has met his VP's wife exactly twice before and doesn't fully remember the context either time. And that's when it happened. Marcus put his hand on my lower back, the way he did at every function, the gesture that had always read to me as affectionate and, I now understood, had always actually been proprietary, and said, with a laugh in his voice, clearly meaning it as some kind of joke about how quiet and background I always was at these things. "Richard, you remember Elena, my side chick, obviously. Don't tell my actual wife." He laughed. Tyler laughed. Even Chloe let out a small, uncomfortable chuckle. Richard Halden looked at me, clearly unsure whether this was an inside joke he was supposed to understand. And then, because that's what people do when they're confused and everyone around them is laughing, he laughed too, a short, awkward bark, and extended his hand to me a second time, as if starting over. "Elena, good to properly meet you," he said. I smiled, the good smile, the controlled one, the one my father taught me is worth more than any legal document, and shook his hand and said, "Likewise, Richard. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of each other." Marcus laughed again at that, thinking I was playing along with his joke. He had no idea how literally true the sentence was. Neither did Richard. I had 8,640 seconds left to wait before every single person in that ballroom would understand exactly what I meant. Dinner service ran for the next hour and 10 minutes, and I want to describe it slowly, because I lived through every minute of it with a kind of hyper-awareness I've never experienced before or since. I remember the exact temperature of the seared halibut, slightly too warm from sitting under the heat lamp too long. I remember the specific shade of gold on the chair backs, a color the event planner had described in an email my father's team had forwarded me, purely by coincidence, as champagne leaf. I remember Vivian, 3 glasses of Sancerre in, leaning across the table to tell a story about the Hale family's old summer house in Newport, a story I had heard, in some form, at least 14 times over 9 years, each version slightly grander than the last, the way memory inflates itself when nobody's around to check the receipts. I remember Tyler asking Marcus, quietly, under the table talk, whether he thought tonight might be the night for the promotion announcement, and Marcus saying, with a confidence that would look almost tragic in 22 minutes, "Richard's basically told me it's happening, it's just a matter of when." I remember Chloe asking me, apropos of nothing, whether I'd thought any more about starting a family soon, a question she asked at almost every family gathering, always in the same bright, faux casual tone, always landing like a small stone dropped into still water, and I remember answering, for the first time in 9 years, with total honesty, "I've been extremely focused on a major deal at work, actually. It's been consuming almost all of my time for months." Chloe nodded, satisfied, clearly hearing this as some vague reference to my little practice, having no idea she was sitting 11 feet from the deal itself, disguised as her sister-in-law's dinner conversation. At 9:40, the lights in the ballroom dimmed by half, the signal every gala in that hotel used to indicate the formal program was beginning, and a woman I recognized as Halden Bishop's head of investor relations, a sharp, efficient woman named Patricia Obi, walked to the podium at the front of the room and tapped the microphone twice. "Good evening, everyone, and thank you for celebrating 22 incredible years with us," she began, and moved through the standard opening remarks, A brief history of the firm, a slideshow of old office photos that got a warm laugh from the room, an acknowledgement of a few long-tenured staff members who stood to modest applause. I watched Marcus during this part, watched him lean toward Richard's table slightly, watched him position himself, almost unconsciously, in the exact posture of a man waiting to be called up for something. Then Patricia said the sentence that started everything. Tonight, we have an incredibly exciting announcement for the future of this firm, and I'd like to invite our CEO, Richard Halden, to the podium to share it personally. Richard walked up, adjusted the microphone, and began speaking about an extraordinary new chapter, about a strategic capital partnership that would position Halden Bishop for the next 22 years and beyond, about the firm being incredibly fortunate to have found a partner who understood the business from the inside out. I felt Marcus go very still beside me, the particular stillness of a man trying to figure out whether this news affects him positively or negatively before he commits to a facial expression. "I'd like to introduce you to the team joining our board," Richard continued, starting with the chair of our newly formed Strategic Oversight Committee, who many of you have actually already met tonight, though perhaps not in the context you'd expect. He looked directly at our table, Marcus's head turned toward Richard, then, slowly, toward me, a flicker of confusion crossing his face that hadn't yet resolved into anything, because the human mind resists the most obvious explanation right up until the last possible second. "Please welcome," Richard said, representing Meridian Crest Holdings and Reyes Capital Group, Ms. Elena Reyes. I stood up. I want you to understand what that moment looked like from Marcus's chair, because I've had a long time to imagine it since. His wife, the quiet one, the one he'd introduced 40 minutes earlier as his side chick in front of his boss, the one his mother had called flexible, and his sister had assumed was available to cover $400 photography invoices without complaint, stood up from table 3, smoothed the front of an emerald Roland Mouret dress he had never once complimented properly, and walked to the podium at the front of a room full of 471 people, while the entire Hale family sat frozen, and 211 of those people who had heard him call me his side chick less than an hour earlier now watched me take the microphone from the CEO of his own company. I didn't rush. I want to say that clearly because I think the version of this moment that would satisfy a movie is one where I deliver some blistering, furious speech, but that's not who I am, and it's not what actually happened. I looked out at the room for a second longer than was comfortable, found Vivian's face first, pale, absolutely still, her wine glass frozen halfway to her mouth. Then Tyler, mouth slightly open. Then Chloe, who had gone the particular shade of red people go when they realize, in real time, that every assumption they've built a relationship on is wrong. I found Brianna Cole's table too, and watched her face shift from mild curiosity to something closer to panic as she began, visibly, to do the math on what Reyes meant next to Marcus's last name. "Good evening," I said. "Some of you know me as Marcus Hale's wife. A few of you, as of about 40 minutes ago, know me as his side chick, which was news to me, but we'll come back to that." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room, the kind of laughter people produce when they're not sure if they're allowed to laugh yet. What most of you don't know is that I'm a forensic accountant. I run Reyes Forensic Advisory, and as of tonight, I'm also the chair of the Strategic Oversight Committee for Halden Bishop Capital, following my father's firm's acquisition of a 51% stake in this company 6 weeks ago. I let that sit for a second. I want to thank Richard for the introduction, and for his partnership through what has been, I promise you, a very thorough due diligence process. I paused, and this is the part where the room's energy, which had been curious, mildly celebratory, still processing the side chick comment as an awkward inside joke, started to shift into something else, something people would describe later as the moment the temperature in the ballroom actually seemed to drop. Part of any serious due diligence process, I continued, involves a full forensic audit of a target company's financials. I want to be transparent with everyone in this room tonight because transparency is exactly what this firm needs going forward. That audit uncovered a sustained embezzlement scheme totaling $11,600,000 routed through a shell company over the past 18 months. Somewhere behind me, I heard a chair scrape against the floor. That finding was referred to federal investigators 11 days ago. And I want to be very clear that this firm, under its new ownership structure, is fully cooperating with that investigation and will continue to do so. I looked directly at table 3 for the first time since I'd started speaking. Marcus had gone the color of the tablecloth. The individual responsible for structuring that fraud, I said, used a shell company called Hartwell Logistics Solutions LLC, registered under an alias built from his childhood address and his mother's maiden name. Vivian's hand went to her mouth. That individual is my husband, Marcus Hale, currently vice president of client development at this firm. The room, 471 people, went completely, totally silent. The kind of silence that has a physical weight to it, and I remember, in that silence, hearing the specific, small sound of Brianna Cole's chair legs scraping 4 tables away as she stood up. Whether to leave or simply out of pure reflex, I never found out, because at that exact moment, the doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and Agent Daniel Osei, along with 3 other federal agents in plain dark suits, walked in. Agent Osei crossed the ballroom floor without hurrying, the way people trained to be in control of a room always move, and stopped in front of table 3. He didn't shout, he didn't need to, the entire room was already holding its breath. "Marcus Hale," he said, showing his badge. "I'm Agent Daniel Osei, FBI White Collar Crimes Division. I need you to come with us." Marcus stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and hit the floor with a crack that echoed off the 22-foot ceiling. "This is insane," he said, his voice climbing, cracking slightly on the second syllable of insane, in a way I'd never heard from him before, not once in 9 years. "Elena, what did you do?" As if I had done something to him. As if $11,600,000 stolen dollars were a thing that had simply happened to him. Whether, an act of God, rather than 18 months of decisions he had made alone, in a room, with a keyboard, using his mother's maiden name. I stayed at the podium, I didn't move toward him, didn't soften my voice, didn't do any of the things 9 years of marriage had trained me to instinctively do when he was distressed. "The documentation is thorough, Marcus," I said into the microphone, because I wanted the room to hear it, not just him. 18 months of wire transfers, forged vendor invoices, and a shell company built using your mother's maiden name and the street you grew up on. Agent Osei's team has copies of everything. So does the SEC. So do Halden Bishop's outside counsel, as of this morning. Agent Osei's colleague stepped forward with handcuffs, and I watched from the podium as my husband of 9 years was read his rights in front of 471 people, including his mother, his brother, his sister, his boss, and, 4 tables away, the woman he'd been sleeping with for at least 9 months. But I wasn't finished, and I think this is the part of the night that people who were in that room still talk about, because I didn't let the fraud be the only thing exposed. As the agents began walking Marcus toward the side exit, I said, still into the microphone, my voice level, almost gentle, the voice I use when I'm delivering the worst possible news to a client in the calmest possible way. I also want to acknowledge publicly, since we're clearly doing full transparency tonight, that this investigation surfaced records showing a pattern of concurrent personal misconduct involving a member of this firm's staff. I won't name names that don't need to be named in a room like this. And here I looked, deliberately, directly, at table 6, letting my eyes rest on Brianna Cole for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for every single person at that table and several tables around it to follow my gaze and understand exactly who I meant, without me ever saying it out loud. But I trust Halden Bishop's HR leadership will be conducting a thorough review of workplace conduct policies in the coming weeks, under the new board's full support. I want to tell you what happened at table 6 in that moment, because Renata, my investigator, was seated 2 tables away specifically to document exactly this, at my request, and her notes from that night are honestly better than anything I could reconstruct from memory alone. Brianna Cole's face went white, then blotchy red, and she stood up so abruptly her wine glass tipped and stained the white tablecloth a deep, spreading burgundy, that someone would later joke looked almost intentional, almost like part of the decor. 2 coworkers at her table physically leaned away from her, the particular social flinch people do when they suddenly, publicly, don't want to be associated with someone anymore. She didn't say anything. She grabbed her clutch and walked, fast, toward the same side exit the agents had just taken Marcus through, though a hotel security guard, at my prior instruction, gently redirected her toward the main lobby instead, away from the federal agents, because that particular confrontation wasn't mine to orchestrate. The company's HR investigation would handle Brianna on its own timeline, which, as I'd later learn, moved considerably faster once 400 witnesses had all seen the same 3-second look. At table 3, the reaction fractured in 3 completely different directions, and if you've ever wondered what a family looks like in the exact moment its foundational myths collapse simultaneously, I can tell you, because I watched it happen in real time from 20 feet away. Vivian Hale sat completely rigid, both hands flat on the tablecloth, staring at the spot where Marcus's overturned chair still lay on its side, and said nothing at all. Not one word, for the entire remaining 40 minutes of the event, which I later learned was its own kind of tell, because Vivian Hale had never in 9 years gone longer than 4 minutes without saying something. Tyler stood up almost as fast as Marcus had, looked wildly around the room as though searching for an exit that didn't involve walking past 471 witnesses, and then, in the single most on-brand moment of the entire evening, turned to Douglas Bennett, Chloe's husband, and asked, quietly but not quietly enough, "Do you think this affects the money he still owes me from the skincare thing?" Chloe didn't answer him. Chloe was staring at me, at the podium, with an expression I'd genuinely never seen on her face before. Not anger exactly, something closer to the specific vertigo of realizing the person you'd spent 9 years quietly, comfortably underestimating had, this entire time, been standing several floors above you. Richard Halden, to his credit, recovered his composure faster than anyone else in the room, walked back to the podium once the agents had cleared Marcus out through the side exit, and said, into the microphone, with the particular smooth authority of a man who has spent 30 years learning how to keep a room from descending into chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for that unexpected development. I think it speaks to exactly the kind of rigorous oversight our new partnership brings to this firm, and frankly, I'm grateful for it," to end quote. A few nervous, scattered laughs rippled through the crowd, and slowly, awkwardly, dinner service resumed, waitstaff clearing plates with the studied blankness of people who had just witnessed something they knew they weren't supposed to have opinions about at work. I stepped down from the podium and walked back to table 3, where Vivian, Tyler, and Chloe sat in a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of confession, and I sat down in my chair, folded my napkin back into my lap, and said, to no one in particular, "The halibut's actually very good tonight. I'd eat it before it goes cold." That's not cruelty, by the way, in case anyone's wondering. That's what 9 years of being underestimated by a family teaches you to do with the 30 seconds immediately after you finally, completely, stopped being underestimated. You eat the halibut. I left the gala at 11:20, alone, in the back of a black car my father's office had arranged weeks earlier, because he'd known, better than I had let myself admit, that I wouldn't want to be standing in that ballroom lobby making small talk with Halden Bishop's board members while processing everything that had just happened. Vivian, Tyler, and Chloe stayed at the table for another 10 minutes after I left, according to Renata's notes, not speaking to each other, before Douglas quietly settled the car service and got everyone home. I didn't hear from any of them that night. I didn't expect to. I want to walk you through the 72 hours immediately following the gala, because a story like this doesn't actually end the moment the dramatic confrontation is over. The paperwork, the follow-through, the unglamorous machinery of consequences, that's where a plan either holds together or falls apart, and I'd spent 4 months making absolutely sure mine would hold. Marcus was formally arraigned 2 days later on federal charges of wire fraud and embezzlement. 11 counts, one for each documented transfer over $100,000, plus a broader conspiracy charge covering the full pattern. His bail was set at $400,000, which, and I want you to sit with the irony of this for a second, none of the Hale family could actually produce on their own, because whatever cash reserves the family had once had were largely gone. Spent decades ago on maintaining an image of wealth the actual balance sheet no longer supported, and whatever liquidity existed in the household Marcus and I shared was, as of that morning, frozen by the same federal investigation that had made him famous in the local business press for all the wrong reasons. Vivian, I later learned, spent 2 days trying to arrange a loan against her Greenwich house, a house that turned out to already carry a second mortgage she'd never disclosed to anyone in the family, taken out 4 years earlier to cover unexpected expenses she'd also never explained. Marcus ultimately sat in county custody for 6 additional days before a bail bondsman arrangement, brokered by a public defender since his firm-provided attorney had, understandably, declined to continue representing him once the embezzlement was proven to have targeted his own employer, finally got him released pending trial. I filed for divorce on the Monday after the gala, 3 business days after the event, through my own attorney, a woman named Diane Okafor who I'd worked with for years on client-adjacent legal matters, and who I'd quietly retained for exactly this purpose 4 months earlier, back when I first found the Hartwell wire. Diane is, and I mean this as the highest possible compliment, one of the most ruthlessly precise people I have ever worked with. She had already drafted the divorce filing, the request for an emergency freeze on any jointly held assets pending the federal investigation, and a formal claim establishing my separate ownership of Reyes Forensic Advisory and all associated assets, completely insulated from anything Marcus's fraud might otherwise entangle. She filed within 4 hours of the courthouse opening that Monday morning, and by that afternoon, Marcus's own attorney was calling mine to ask, with what Diane described to me later as genuine disbelief, how a divorce filing this comprehensive had been prepared this quickly. The answer, of course, was that it hadn't been prepared quickly at all. It had been prepared over 4 months, in parallel with everything else, the way every piece of this had been prepared. The financial picture that emerged over the following weeks, as forensic accountants working for the federal prosecution began cross-referencing my firm's initial findings against Halden Bishop's full books, ended up being even worse than my original number. The $11,600,000 I'd traced through Hartwell Logistics Solutions LLC turned out to be the core of the scheme, but investigators found an additional $1.4 million in smaller, earlier transfers Marcus had made through a separate, cruder method before he'd built the Hartwell structure. Padded expense reports, inflated vendor contracts with companies that turned out to be owned by people he'd gone to college with, willing to kick back a percentage in exchange for looking the other way. The full total, once the federal case was complete, came to $13 million exactly, embezzled from Halden Bishop Capital over a period of just under 3 years, nearly double the timeline I'd originally traced, because Marcus, it turned out, had started small, testing what he could get away with, more than a year before the Hartwell Shell Company had ever been formed. The affair, once HR launched its formal investigation the Monday after the gala, unraveled with a speed that surprised even me. Brianna Cole was placed on administrative leave that same day, and within 2 weeks, once HR's investigators had pulled the same badge swipe records Renata had originally obtained, along with internal messaging records the company's IT department was legally able to produce under the new board's authority, it became clear that Brianna's misconduct extended well beyond a personal relationship with a married colleague. She had, over the prior year, used her access to certain client relationship files to help Marcus identify which of Halden Bishop's institutional clients had the least active oversight of their accounts. Information that made 3 of the fraudulent vendor arrangements considerably easier to disguise, because Marcus had specifically targeted accounts Brianna told him were unlikely to be closely audited that quarter. She wasn't just having an affair. She had, whether she'd fully understood the implications at the time or not, been feeding information that materially assisted a $13 million fraud, and once HR's findings were forwarded to federal investigators, her role shifted from terminated employee to person of interest, and eventually, 4 months later, to a co-defendant facing her own charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, though prosecutors, recognizing her more limited role, ultimately allowed her to plead to a single reduced count in exchange for full cooperation and testimony against Marcus. I sat through 3 separate depositions over the following 2 months, giving testimony to federal prosecutors, to Halden Bishop's outside counsel, and, eventually, to my own divorce attorney's team as the asset division proceedings moved forward. I want to be honest with you about something during this period, because I think it's important, and because I don't want you to walk away from this video thinking that watching your husband get arrested at a black tie gala feels like a victory lap the entire time. It didn't. There were nights during those 2 months where I sat in my apartment. I'd moved out of the house Marcus and I shared within the first week, into a corporate rental my firm kept on retainer for exactly these kinds of transitions, and felt something that wasn't triumph at all, something closer to grief for a version of my life I genuinely believed in for years. A version where the late nights and the boring paperwork jokes and Vivian's little comments about starter watches were just the ordinary friction of a real marriage, rather than the visible edges of something rotten underneath. Grief and vindication can occupy the same body at the same time. Nobody warns you about that part. Let me take you 14 months forward now, because that's how long it took for every thread of this story to finish playing out, and I think the ending only means something if you see exactly where everyone landed, not in some vague, satisfying summary, but in specific, concrete terms, the same way I've told you everything else. Marcus's trial began 10 months after the gala and lasted 11 days. His attorney tried to argue diminished culpability, tried to frame the Hartwell scheme as a financial management error rather than deliberate fraud, an argument that collapsed almost immediately once prosecutors introduced the Shell Company's formation documents and the deliberate use of his mother's maiden name and childhood address as an alias. evidence that a jury of 12 people took less than 90 minutes to find utterly damning. Because there is no innocent explanation for building a fake identity out of your own family history unless you already know what you're doing is wrong. He was convicted on all 11 counts of wire fraud and the broader conspiracy charge, and sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, along with a restitution order requiring him to repay the full $13 million to Halden Bishop Capital, a sum he will almost certainly never fully satisfy in his lifetime, given that every asset he held, the Cayenne, the wine collection, the $12,000 watch, all of it was seized as part of the forfeiture proceedings within the first 4 months of the investigation. He is currently incarcerated at a federal facility in Pennsylvania. I have not visited him. I have not spoken to him since the morning of his arraignment, when he called me 11 times from a number I didn't recognize, and I let every call go to voicemail, because I had already said everything I needed to say to him, from a podium in front of 471 witnesses, and I did not feel I owed him a private repeat performance. Brianna Cole's plea deal, finalized 8 months after the gala, resulted in 3 years of probation and a permanent bar from working in any FINRA-regulated financial services role, a restriction that effectively ended the career she'd spent 9 years building. The last information I have on her, through a mutual industry contact who mentioned it to Renata almost in passing, is that she relocated to Charlotte and took a job in retail management at a shopping mall, a considerable distance, both geographically and professionally, from the Director of Client Relations title she'd held at Halden Bishop, and from the particular kind of arrogance that had once let her believe a smile across a crowded ballroom made her untouchable. Vivian Hale, I learned through Chloe, who reached out to me once, briefly, about 4 months after the gala, sold the Greenwich house 11 weeks after Marcus's sentencing, once the second mortgage she'd hidden from the family for years finally came due in full and there was no remaining income stream, from Marcus or anyone else, to help cover it. She moved into a 2-bedroom condominium in a town 40 minutes north, considerably smaller than anything she'd lived in during the previous 3 decades, and according to Chloe, has largely withdrawn from the social circles she once dominated, unable to sustain the version of herself that required an audience who still believed the Hale name carried the weight it used to. I don't say this with satisfaction, exactly. I say it because it's simply what happened, the direct and traceable consequence of 30 years spent performing a financial reality that no longer existed, propped up, unknowingly, by her younger son's crimes. Tyler Hale, cut off entirely from the informal cash flow that had quietly subsidized his ventures for years, once Marcus's assets were frozen and Vivian's finances collapsed, took a job, his first job lasting longer than 14 months in his entire adult life, as an account manager at a regional marketing agency, a position Douglas Bennett, Chloe's husband, actually helped him secure, out of what I can only assume was some combination of family loyalty and simple pragmatism, since nobody else was going to keep quietly funding a 38-year-old man's Instagram consulting career indefinitely. As far as I know, he's still there, still employed, which, given his history, I suppose counts as its own kind of ending. Chloe, interestingly, is the one member of that family I've maintained any contact with at all, thin as it is. She called me 4 months after the gala, not to apologize exactly, but to ask, in a voice I'd never heard from her before, quieter, considerably less certain than the version of her that used to toast her own party planning at Christmas, whether I'd be willing to have coffee sometime. We met once at a small cafe near my office, and she spent most of the conversation asking careful, genuinely curious questions about what I actually did for a living, questions nobody in that family had ever bothered to ask me in 9 years, and at the end she said something I still think about. I think we all just assumed you were the simple one, because you let us assume it, and I don't know if that's on us or on you, but I'm sorry either way. I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it, though I also didn't correct the framing, because she wasn't entirely wrong. I did let them assume it. For years. That was, in its own way, a strategy too. As for Richard Halden, he remained CEO of Halden Bishop Capital, now operating under Reyes Capital Group's majority ownership, and to his credit, once the dust settled, he became one of the strongest advocates on the board for the exact kind of rigorous financial oversight that had exposed Marcus's fraud in the first place, implementing new internal controls that my firm helped design over the following 6 months as part of the acquisition's compliance overhaul. He and I have a good working relationship now, professional, respectful, occasionally, on his part, still visibly a little sheepish about the awkward laugh he gave when Marcus made that joke at the start of the gala. He's mentioned it exactly twice since, both times unprompted, both times ending with some version of, "I really am sorry about that, I had no idea." I've told him both times that he has absolutely nothing to apologize for. He didn't build the fraud, and he certainly didn't build the marriage. As for me, Rhea's forensic advisory grew considerably in the wake of the case, partly because the Halden Bishop matter became, discreetly, one of the most talked about forensic accounting cases in regional financial circles that year, and partly because I found, once the dust settled, that I had an appetite for exactly the kind of institutional scale work the acquisition had pulled me into. I now sit on the Strategic Oversight Committee for 2 additional portfolio companies under Reyes Capital Group, and 8 months ago I finalized the purchase of a townhouse entirely in my own name, paid in full, using money I earned, every dollar of it traceable, documented, and mine, a small, specific kind of satisfaction that I don't think anyone who hasn't spent years quietly underestimated by their own family can fully understand. I still keep the emerald Roland Mouret dress in the back of my closet. I haven't worn it since. I don't think I need to. Here's what I want to leave you with, because I promised you a lesson, not just a story. For years, I let a family believe that quiet meant simple, that a woman who didn't perform her status loudly must not have much status to perform. I let a husband believe that boring paperwork meant powerless, right up until the paperwork became the exact instrument of his downfall. I think a lot of us do some version of this. We let the people who underestimate us keep underestimating us, because it's easier, because confrontation is exhausting, because there's a strange, quiet power in being the person nobody in the room thinks to watch closely. But I want to ask you something, genuinely, not rhetorically. How long are you willing to let people keep mistaking your patience for your ceiling? I want to go back now and fill in something I skipped over, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how deep this family's patterns ran. And because there's a version of the story between the Sunday brunch I told you about and the night of the gala that I haven't given you yet, the 11 days between filing my findings with Agent Osei and the gala itself, the 11 days where I had to keep functioning as a wife, a daughter-in-law, a sister-in-law, while knowing the exact date the whole structure would collapse. On day 3 of those 11 days, Marcus came home unusually early, 6:40 instead of his usual 8:30, and told me Richard had mentioned, almost in passing, that some kind of internal review was happening related to a few of the firm's vendor contracts. He said it lightly, almost annoyed, framing it as bureaucratic overreach, the kind of thing a company does periodically to look thorough to its board. I remember standing at the kitchen counter, chopping cilantro for a dinner I had no appetite for, and asking, in the most neutral voice I could manage, "Does that worry you at all?" He laughed. Actually laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, the kind I used to love in the early years, and said, "Elena, I built half the vendor approval process myself. I know exactly where the gaps are. If anyone's going to find something weird in that system, it's going to be an accident, not a real investigation." I have never, before or since, heard someone describe the precise mechanics of their own downfall with that much unearned confidence, and I remember having to turn back to the cutting board because I genuinely could not trust my face not to react. On day 6, Vivian called, ostensibly about gala seating, but spent the first 10 minutes of the call telling me about a wonderful article she'd read about a young couple who'd recently bought a house in Newport near the old Hale Summer property, using it, as she often did, as a vehicle to remind me, gently, constantly, that the family's former scale of wealth was a benchmark I should somehow be helping Marcus reach again. "Marcus tells me things are going very well at the firm," she said. "I do hope this promotion comes through soon. It would mean so much to see him back where this family belongs." I told her I hoped so too, which was, again, technically true, in the sense that I did hope Marcus ended up where this family belonged, though my definition of that phrase and hers were, by that point, separated by an ocean I hadn't yet told her existed. On day 9, 2 days before the gala, I had dinner with my father, just the two of us, at a small restaurant he liked near his office, the kind of place with no sign out front and a chef who'd known him for 20 years. He asked me, over the second course, whether I was ready. Not ready for the deal to close, not ready for the announcement, just, "Are you ready?" The specific, complete question a parent asks when they already know the professional pieces are perfectly in place and they're really checking on the human being underneath them. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that some part of me kept running through scenarios where Marcus somehow deserved a version of grace I hadn't built into the plan. Some private conversation, some chance to explain himself before the whole thing became public. My father put down his fork, and said something I've carried with me since. Elena, grace and consequences aren't opposites. You can forgive a person completely, in your own heart, on your own time, and still let the system that exists to hold people accountable do exactly what it's built to do. Waiting to punish him privately so you can feel like the bigger person isn't grace. It's just delay, dressed up as virtue. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I was standing at that podium 2 nights later, and I realized, delivering that announcement, that I felt something closer to clean than cruel. The specific, unglamorous relief of simply letting a true thing be said out loud, in front of the people who needed to hear it, instead of managing it quietly forever. On day 11, the morning of the gala itself, I did something I haven't mentioned yet, something small, but something I think closes a loop I opened earlier in this story without fully resolving it. I drove to the UPS store in Stamford that served as Hartwell Logistics Solutions LLC's registered mailing address, the same one Renata had first identified months earlier, and I sat in my car across the street for almost 20 minutes, watching the door, not entirely sure what I was hoping to see. I think, if I'm honest, I wanted some kind of visual confirmation that the fraud was real in a physical sense, not just in spreadsheets and wire logs. Some tangible proof that the $11.6 million, soon to be revealed as 13, existed somewhere in the actual world and not just in my own carefully organized case file. Nothing happened. It was just a UPS store, beige and fluorescent lit, a teenage employee restocking shipping boxes near the window, completely unaware that the mailbox 2 feet from him had, for over a year, served as the physical anchor point for one of the largest embezzlement schemes in the firm's history. I sat there a while longer than I needed to, and then I drove home to get ready for the gala, and put on the emerald dress, and did my makeup at my own bathroom mirror, while Marcus got dressed in the next room, humming something under his breath, completely unaware that he was getting dressed for the last black tie event he would attend as a free man for the next several years. I think, to really understand why it took me 9 years to see this family clearly, you need to understand the version of Marcus I fell in love with, because it wasn't a lie exactly, or at least it wasn't only a lie. Some of it was real, and I think that's actually the harder thing to reconcile than if he'd simply been a con artist from day one. We got married on a Saturday in June, 7 years before the gala, at a small vineyard property upstate that my father had actually helped find, because Vivian's original proposal, an enormous production at a country club in Greenwich with a guest list of 340 people, most of whom neither Marcus nor I could name without checking a spreadsheet, had felt, even then, before I understood the family's finances at all, like a performance we were being asked to fund on behalf of people who wanted the photographs more than they wanted us to be happy. My father quietly covered the majority of the actual wedding costs, framed diplomatically to Vivian as letting the Reyes side handle the venue since we found it. $140,000 that Vivian, to this day as far as I know, believes was a modest gesture rather than nearly the entire budget for the event. I didn't know at the time how prophetic that arrangement would turn out to be, the Reyes side quietly funding the appearance of Hale family generosity, a pattern that would repeat itself, in smaller and larger forms, for the next 7 years. Marcus, on our wedding day, cried during his vows, which surprised everyone who knew him professionally, because at work he cultivated a reputation for being unshakable, the guy who could deliver bad quarterly numbers to a room of nervous investors without breaking a sweat. He told me, in front of 110 guests, that I was the only person who ever made him feel like enough without a title attached to it, a line I've turned over in my head more times than I can count in the years since, because I think, at the time he said it, he actually meant it, and I think that specific insecurity, the fear of not being enough without the title, without the appearance of wealth, without the Hale name carrying the weight it used to, is the exact same insecurity that, 11 years later, drove him to build a shell company out of his childhood address, rather than simply live within the means of a $210,000 salary that, by any reasonable measure, most people would consider more than enough. The first 3 years of our marriage were, genuinely, some of the best of my life. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in the city, well below what either of our incomes could have technically afforded, because we'd both, or so I believed, made a deliberate choice to build slowly rather than perform wealth we hadn't yet earned. Marcus used to make breakfast on Sunday mornings, elaborate, slightly too ambitious breakfasts, once attempting a croquembouche for my birthday that collapsed spectacularly in the kitchen and that we ate anyway, laughing, off paper towels because we hadn't unpacked enough dishes yet from a move that had happened 8 months earlier. I built Reyes Forensic Advisory's client base almost entirely from scratch during those years, taking cases my father's firm was too large to bother with, small business fraud, contentious divorce audits, the unglamorous work that actually teaches you how people hide things. And Marcus was, during that period, one of my most consistent sources of encouragement, staying up late to help me build spreadsheet templates, celebrating every new client with a bottle of cheap champagne he'd pretend was expensive, doing a whole bit about the label. The shift, when I trace it back now with the particular clarity hindsight always provides, started around year 4, roughly coinciding with Marcus's promotion to vice president at Halden Bishop Capital and the corresponding, gradual reintegration of his family's old social circle into our lives. It wasn't a single dramatic moment, it was small, a slightly nicer car lease he justified as necessary for client meetings, a country club membership Vivian pushed hard for, and that Marcus agreed to, just for networking. A shift in how he talked about money, less, we're building this together, and more, we need to look a certain way. I didn't clock it as dangerous at the time because it happened slowly, over roughly 18 months, the exact kind of gradual erosion that's almost impossible to see clearly while you're standing inside it. The way you can't watch your own hair go gray in real time, only in photographs taken years apart. I want to give you one more scene from this period, because I think it's the clearest single moment where I can now see the entire trajectory of what was coming, even though at the time it just felt like an ordinary, mildly annoying Tuesday. Marcus came home from a dinner with Richard Halden and 2 other senior partners, visibly buzzing, and told me, almost breathlessly, that Richard had made an offhand comment comparing Marcus favorably to old money families who actually know how to hold on to what they've built. A comment Marcus repeated to me 3 separate times that night, clearly turning it over like a coin he wanted to keep touching. I remember feeling a small, specific unease at how much that single sentence seemed to matter to him, how much weight he was putting on a stranger's passing comparison to a mythologized version of his own family's history, a history that, by that point, I already suspected was considerably more fiction than fact. I asked him, gently, why it mattered so much what Richard thought about old money. He looked at me like the question genuinely didn't make sense and said, because that's what we're supposed to be, Elena. That's what the Hale name is supposed to mean. I didn't push further that night. I wish sometimes that I had. Though I'm not sure it would have changed anything. By that point, I think the version of Marcus who needed to prove something to a room full of men with more inherited money than he had was already fully formed, already looking for a way to close the gap between the family myth and the family's actual bank statements, and 18 months later, he found one, in a shell company built from his own childhood address. Let me take you inside the trial itself for a moment, because I skipped past it fairly quickly earlier, and I think the specific texture of those 11 days matters, especially for anyone watching this who's ever wondered what it actually looks like when a case like mine moves from a private investigation into a public courtroom. The trial was held in a federal courthouse downtown, courtroom 4C, a room with none of the theatrical grandeur people expect from television. Fluorescent lighting, government-issue carpet the color of wet sand, a judge named the Honorable Miriam Castellano, who ran her courtroom with a brisk, no-nonsense efficiency that I came, over 11 days, to genuinely respect. I testified on day 3, for just under 4 hours, walking the jury through the same Hartwell Logistics Solutions LLC trail I'd originally traced at my own kitchen island, except this time with exhibit numbers, blown-up bank statements projected onto a screen, and a defense attorney doing his best, on cross-examination, to suggest that my findings were somehow tainted by personal motive, a line of questioning Judge Castellano allowed for exactly 6 minutes before sustaining an objection from the prosecution that effectively ended it. I remember sitting in the witness box, looking out at the gallery, and seeing Vivian there, in the second row, in a gray coat, alone, Tyler and Chloe apparently unable to bring themselves to attend more than the opening day, watching her son's own wife walk a jury through $13 million of documented theft with a steadiness that I think, more than anything else in that trial, finally convinced her, completely and without further argument, that the woman she'd once called flexible and complimented on her starter watch had never once been the person she thought she was dealing with. Agent Osei testified on day 5, walking the jury through the FBI's independent verification of everything my firm had originally found, along with additional financial records his team had subpoenaed directly from 3 separate banks. Records that traced an additional $200,000 in transfers my original investigation hadn't caught. Money Marcus had moved through a cryptocurrency exchange in the final 6 weeks before the gala, apparently sensing, on some subconscious level, that pressure was building, even though he had no idea the federal investigation had already formally begun. Brianna Cole testified on day 7 as part of her plea agreement, and I watched her walk to the witness stand in a plain navy suit, nothing like the black dress or the Alexander McQueen I remembered from company functions, and describe, in a flat, rehearsed voice, exactly how Marcus had asked her, roughly 14 months into their affair, to just mention, casually, which client accounts seemed a little sleepy this quarter, a request she said she hadn't fully understood the purpose of at the time, though the prosecution's closing argument made clear that a director of client relations with 9 years of industry experience absolutely understood what she was being asked to help conceal, whether she wanted to admit it under oath or not. Marcus did not testify in his own defense, on the advice of his attorney, a decision that I think, watching from the gallery, spoke volumes on its own. He sat at the defense table for 11 days in a gray suit that had visibly started fitting him more loosely by the final week, watching the evidence build against him piece by piece, occasionally writing notes to his attorney, occasionally glancing back toward the gallery, though never once, in 11 days, toward me. The jury deliberated for 87 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, a number so short that even the prosecuting attorney later told my own lawyer, in the hallway afterward, that he'd expected at least a half day of deliberation given the technical complexity of the financial evidence. 87 minutes for $13 million, 3 years of deception, and a marriage built, at least in its final chapter, on a foundation that had never actually existed. Sentencing came 6 weeks later, in a separate hearing where I gave a brief victim impact statement, not as an emotional plea because that's not really my register, but as a clear, factual account of the operational and reputational damage the fraud had caused Halden Bishop Capital. Damage that, as the new chair of the firm's Strategic Oversight Committee, I was uniquely positioned to quantify with precision. Client attrition in the 2 quarters following the initial disclosure, the cost of the outside compliance overhaul my own firm had been retained to design, the specific, dollar-figure toll of rebuilding institutional trust after a senior executive had spent 3 years quietly bleeding the company from the inside. Judge Castellano's sentencing remarks, which I still have a transcript of somewhere in a folder I haven't opened in months, described the case as a particularly calculated breach of trust, made more troubling by the defendant's evident willingness to weaponize even his own family history in service of concealment. A line that I think captures, more precisely than anything I could have written myself, exactly what made this case land the way it did with everyone who followed it. I want to go back to something I mentioned briefly and give it the space it actually deserves, because I think it's the part of this story people ask me about most when they hear it in person. More than the gala, more than the arrest. They want to know what the actual months of quiet investigation felt like, day to day, because I spent 4 months secretly building a federal case against my own husband while continuing to sleep next to him every night, is a sentence that's easy to say and considerably harder to actually live inside. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from performing normalcy while holding a secret that large, and I don't think people who haven't done it fully understand how physical it becomes. I lost 11 pounds over those 4 months, not from any deliberate effort, just from the simple mechanical fact that stress burns through you when you're maintaining 2 completely separate internal realities at once. The version of me that made dinner reservations, that asked Marcus how his day was and actually listened to the answer, that let him rest his hand on my lower back at company events, and the version of me that spent every night after he fell asleep sitting at my kitchen island with 3 monitors open, cross-referencing wire transfer dates against his calendar, building a case file that would eventually run to over 400 pages. I developed a habit during that period of leaving my phone in a drawer in my home office rather than on the nightstand, telling Marcus I found the blue light disruptive to my sleep, which was true, but which also meant Renata could text me updates at 11:40 at night without me having to explain, mid-conversation over dinner, why my phone had suddenly lit up with a message from a private investigator. I saw a therapist twice during that period, someone I found specifically because she had experience with clients navigating high-conflict divorces and financial betrayal, though I never told her the full scope of what I was building, partly for legal reasons around privileged information, partly because I wasn't entirely sure, even in a confidential room, how to say out loud that I was simultaneously the most powerful person in my own marriage and the most surveilled, watching my husband's every move with the trained eye of a professional while he had no idea he was being watched at all. She asked me once, during our second session, whether I was scared of what I might find if I kept digging. I told her, honestly, that I wasn't scared of what I'd find. By that point, I already had the Hartwell numbers, I already knew the scale of it. I was scared of who I might become in the process of proving it. Whether 4 months of cold, methodical surveillance of someone I'd once loved without complication would leave some permanent residue in me, some inability to ever again be simply, uncomplicatedly present with another person without running a background check on their behavior first. I still think about that question sometimes, more than a year later. I don't have a clean answer for it yet. What I can tell you is what actually got me through those months, practically speaking, because I think it's useful for anyone watching this who might be somewhere in the early stages of a similar situation. I built a structure, the same way I'd build a structure for any complex case, with defined phases and defined checkpoints, because open-ended uncertainty is what breaks people, and defined phases are what let you keep functioning. Phase 1 was documentation, collecting everything, verifying everything, never acting on anything until it was airtight. Phase 2 was legal protection, making sure I was fully insulated before I was fully informed, retaining Diane, structuring my own assets so nothing Marcus had touched could ever be construed as jointly mine in a way that would create legal exposure. Phase 3 was strategic timing, which is where my father's acquisition came in, giving me not just evidence but actual institutional power over the exact company and the exact people who needed to answer for what had happened. And Phase 4, the one I didn't fully plan for in advance, the one that only became clear to me in the final 2 weeks before the gala, was allowing myself to feel something other than pure procedural focus, allowing myself, finally, after 4 months of forced neutrality, to actually feel angry, not in a way that would compromise the case, but in a way that let me stand at that podium and deliver the truth with the specific, controlled heat of someone who has genuinely earned the right to say it. I think a lot about a conversation I had with my father the week after the sentencing, when the whole thing was finally, legally, completely over. I asked him whether he thought I'd handled it correctly, whether there was a version of this where I could have protected myself just as thoroughly without letting it play out as publicly, as dramatically, as it ultimately did. He thought about it for a while. My father always thinks before he answers, another thing he taught me, and said, "Elena, you could have handled the fraud quietly. You could have gotten your money back, gotten your divorce, walked away clean, and let Halden Bishop's board handle the rest privately, out of the papers, without anyone at that gala ever hearing your name at all. But you didn't just want to be protected. You wanted to be seen accurately, finally, by everyone who'd spent years deciding you were smaller than you actually were. That's not vanity. That's just a debt getting paid." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else he's ever said to me, because I think it's the most honest explanation anyone's given me, including myself, for why I chose the podium over the quiet lawyer's letter, why I chose 471 witnesses over a private settlement, why some part of this was never really about Marcus at all, but about every single person who had spent 9 years mistaking my patience for my ceiling. I want to tell you about my father's own history for a moment, because I think it explains a lot about where I learned to build a plan like this one, and because his story is, in its own way, its own quiet lesson about the exact same theme: the danger of letting people decide what you're capable of before you've shown them. Julian Reyes grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store his own father ran for 31 years, in a neighborhood that, by the time I was born, had been almost entirely gentrified into the kind of place where a 2-bedroom apartment now rents for 4 times what his father's entire hardware store used to gross in a year. He put himself through business school working nights at a freight forwarding company, a job that, decades later, gave him the specific, granular understanding of logistics and supply chain finance that let him identify, at 29 years old, a small warehouse acquisition opportunity that everyone else in his firm's junior analyst pool had dismissed as too small to bother modeling properly. He bought it anyway, using a personal loan co-signed by an uncle who, as family legend has it, only agreed after making my father sit through a full hour of questioning about every line item in the deal, treating a 29-year-old's business plan with the same rigor a bank underwriter would apply to a 9-figure loan. My father passed that test, bought the warehouse, and built, over the following 3 decades, the $2.1 billion holding company that would eventually let him quietly acquire 51% of the very firm employing the son-in-law who was stealing from it. He never let me forget where that came from, and he never let the eventual size of Reyes Capital Group turn into the kind of performed wealth I watched consume the Hale family over the years I was married into it. I grew up with a father who, even after his firm crossed $1 billion in assets under management, still drove a 12-year-old sedan because, in his words, a car doesn't make the decisions, the person driving it does, and I'd rather people underestimate my car than overestimate my judgment. I think that specific philosophy, more than any single piece of technical training, is the actual inheritance he gave me. Not the money, though the money certainly helped when it came time to structure an acquisition large enough to give me institutional leverage over Halden Bishop Capital, but the deeper instinct underneath it, the understanding that being underestimated isn't a wound, it's a resource, if you're patient enough and precise enough to use it correctly. My mother died when I was 19, a car accident on a rain-slicked highway upstate. And I think that loss is part of why my father and I built the kind of relationship we have. Direct, unsentimental on the surface, but with an underlying loyalty that I never once, in the entire ordeal with Marcus, had to question. He didn't ask me to justify wanting revenge. He didn't ask me to consider Marcus's feelings or Vivian's social standing, or whether exposing everything publicly might be seen as excessive by people who preferred their scandals handled with more restraint. He asked me one question: does Halden know yet? And then he spent 6 weeks quietly restructuring a multi-$100 million acquisition to make sure his daughter would have every possible tool available to handle the rest of it exactly the way she chose. That's not the kind of support you find described often in family drama, the kind that doesn't ask you to be smaller, doesn't ask you to consider everyone else's comfort first, just asks what you need and then builds it, quietly, in the background, while you're still gathering the courage to ask for it directly. I've thought a lot in the months since the gala about what it means to have grown up watched over by someone who built an empire out of being underestimated by an uncle who made him defend every line item of his very first deal, married into a family that mistook quiet competence for weakness for 9 consecutive years, and ended up, somehow, using the exact same instinct that built my father's fortune to expose the exact family that had spent nearly a decade failing to notice it in me. There's a symmetry to that I don't think I fully appreciated until I was standing at that podium, in the emerald dress, watching Vivian Hale's face go the color of the tablecloth. I wasn't channeling some sudden, dramatic transformation that night. I was simply, finally, letting the room see the version of me that had been there the entire time. The one built out of freight forwarding shifts and hardware store apartments, and a father who taught me that being quiet and being powerful were never actually opposites, no matter how badly a family like the Hales needed to believe otherwise in order to keep feeling comfortable about who they'd decided I was. I want to close this out with where things stand for me now, professionally and personally, because I think endings matter, and I don't want to leave you with just the courtroom and the epilogue of everyone else's consequences without telling you honestly where I actually landed. Reyes Forensic Advisory now employs 14 people, up from a team of 4 before the Halden Bishop case, and we've taken on 3 additional institutional clients directly as a result of the case's visibility in regional financial circles, including, somewhat ironically, 2 companies that specifically sought us out because they wanted a forensic team with direct, hands-on experience uncovering exactly the kind of executive-level embezzlement that had taken down Marcus. I sit on 2 additional oversight boards now, beyond Halden Bishop, and I've started, over the past 6 months, mentoring 2 younger women in the forensic accounting field, both of whom, interestingly, mentioned in our very first conversation that people in their own lives, bosses, family members, sometimes partners, tend to describe them as quiet or reserved, in a tone that always seems to carry a faint undertone of dismissal. And I tell both of them exactly what I wish someone had told me 9 years ago. Quiet is not the same as small, and the people who mistake the two are, almost without exception, the ones who end up most surprised by what you were building the entire time they weren't paying attention. I haven't dated anyone seriously since the divorce finalized, 5 months ago now. I'm not in any particular hurry. I think, for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I'm actually enjoying the specific, uncomplicated pleasure of a life that belongs entirely to me, structured entirely around my own decisions, unencumbered by anyone else's insecurities about old money or family names or what a wife is supposed to look like at a company gala. I bought the townhouse I mentioned earlier with cash, no mortgage, every dollar of it earned and documented, and on the day I closed on it, I sat alone in the empty living room for almost an hour before the movers arrived, just looking at the light coming through the windows. thinking about how strange it is that the most peaceful moment of an entire year, built out of fraud investigations and federal courtrooms and a very public divorce, was simply sitting on the floor of an empty room that belonged, completely and unambiguously, to no one but me. I get asked, more than almost anything else, whether I feel guilty about how public I made it, whether there was a kinder version of that night available to me that I simply chose not to take. I want to answer that honestly because I think it's the question that matters most if you're the kind of person who's ever been tempted to handle your own version of this quietly, out of some instinct toward decency that the people who hurt you never extended to you in return. Here's what I've come to understand. A year and a half out from that gala, quiet was the thing I'd already tried. Quiet was 9 years of letting Vivian's comments about starter watches slide past me with a polite smile. Quiet was covering Chloe's $400 photography invoices without a word of pushback. Quiet was absorbing Tyler's endless small loans as simply the cost of being married into a family that operated that way. Quiet was watching Brianna Cole's hand linger a half-second too long on my husband's forearm at a company barbecue and telling myself I was imagining things, because confronting it would have been loud, and I had spent a lifetime being taught, gently, by well-meaning people, that loud women lose credibility, that the sophisticated move is always the restrained one. Quiet, I eventually realized, 4 months into an investigation that revealed $13 million in theft and at least 9 months of documented betrayal, is not actually a virtue in itself. It's just a strategy, and strategies only deserve to be repeated if they're working. Mine had stopped working roughly the moment I found that first $8,000 wire transfer, and I think part of growing into the person capable of standing at that podium was accepting that the kinder, quieter option I kept imagining wasn't actually kindness at all. It was just habit, dressed up in a nicer word. I also want to address something specific, because I know it comes up in the comments every time I tell any part of this story. People ask whether exposing Brianna publicly, with that 3-second look toward table 6, was fair to her, given that she was, in some legal sense, also a victim of Marcus's manipulation, drawn into an affair by a charming married man who told her things about his marriage that were, presumably, not entirely accurate. I've thought about this carefully, and here's where I've landed. Brianna Cole was not a naive bystander swept up by a master manipulator. She was a 31-year-old professional with 9 years of industry experience, fully capable of independently deciding not to sleep with a married colleague, fully capable of recognizing that which client accounts seem a little sleepy this quarter was not an innocent question from a man she happened to have feelings for. Sympathy for the specific mechanics of how an affair begins does not extend, in my view, to sympathy for someone who then actively assisted in concealing a multi-million-dollar fraud, however peripherally, because doing so served her own interests too. People are allowed to make bad decisions born out of genuine emotional confusion. They are not automatically absolved of the practical consequences those decisions create for other people, including the consequences that follow them into a courtroom. I want to talk briefly about Renata Ford, the investigator who did so much of the unglamorous, methodical work that made this entire case possible, because I think her role in this story deserves more than the passing mentions I've given it so far. Renata has been doing this work for 19 years, most of it not nearly as dramatic as this case turned out to be. She spends most of her time on far less cinematic matters: custody disputes involving hidden assets, small business partners skimming from each other, the unglamorous plumbing of human dishonesty that rarely makes for a gala confrontation. I asked her once, near the end of the case, whether she found it strange, doing this kind of work for a living, spending her career documenting exactly the ways people betray the people closest to them. She told me something I've thought about often since. Elena, I don't think of it as documenting betrayal. I think of it as documenting truth that someone's trying to keep buried. The betrayal already happened before I ever get the call. My job is just making sure it doesn't get to stay hidden. I think that reframing matters because it's easy in a story like this to focus on the drama of exposure and forget that exposure is really just truth finally being allowed to exist in the open, after months or years of someone actively working to prevent exactly that. I've also had a lot of people ask me, in the comments on earlier videos and in messages I get through my firm's contact page, whether I regret marrying Marcus at all. Whether, if I could go back to that fundraiser in the Hamptons 9 years ago, I'd choose differently knowing everything I know now. I don't think that's actually a useful question to answer honestly, because it assumes a version of hindsight that didn't exist for me at 25. Standing at a fundraiser, talking to a tall, tanned, genuinely charming man who asked good questions and actually listened to the answers. The Marcus who cried during his wedding vows and burned a croquembouche for my birthday was real, in the sense that those moments genuinely happened and genuinely meant something to both of us at the time. The Marcus who built a shell company out of his own childhood address was also real, and I think the actual, uncomfortable truth of this story is that both versions coexisted in the same person for the entire 9 years, and my failure wasn't in choosing him at 25. Nobody has access to 9 years of future evidence when they fall in love with someone. My failure, if I had one, was in taking 4 years too long to notice the gap between the two versions had stopped closing and started widening. And I think that's a far more useful lesson than a simple, tidy regret about the marriage itself. There's one more thread I haven't fully closed for you, and I've been saving it because I think it belongs near the end rather than buried in the middle of the timeline. The question of what actually happened to the $13 million itself. Mechanically. Once the restitution order was in place. Because I think the financial cleanup of a case like this is almost as instructive as the fraud itself. And it's the part nobody ever asks about in the comments. Probably because it's the least dramatic and the most simply tediously true. Of the $13 million Marcus embezzled, federal forfeiture proceedings recovered approximately $4.1 million in identifiable seizable assets. The leased Cayenne, sold at auction for $81,000 against an original lease value that made the car itself a bad investment even before you factor in it was purchased with stolen money. The wine collection, appraised and liquidated through a specialty auction house for $244,000, considerably less than Marcus had told me it was worth when he described it, more than once, as appreciating faster than the market. The contents of the brokerage account he'd built under a secondary shell entity, frozen and seized in full at $2.9 million, the single largest recovered chunk. And various smaller assets, including the $12,000 watch sold for scrap-adjacent value at auction because, as it turns out, a watch someone else already knows was purchased with stolen money, doesn't hold its resale price nearly as well as the original buyer assumed it would. The remaining $8.9 million is technically still owed under the restitution order, structured as automatic garnishment against any future earnings Marcus generates for the rest of his life. A debt that will follow him, quite literally, until either it's paid in full or he dies, whichever comes first. And given that a convicted felon with a wire fraud record on a scale this size is unlikely to ever again hold a position paying anywhere close to the $210,000 a year he made at Halden Bishop Capital, the honest, unsentimental math suggests that most of that remaining balance will simply never be recovered, a fact the restitution order accounts for explicitly, structuring payments as a percentage of future earnings rather than a fixed schedule, precisely because the drafters understood, better than anyone, exactly how unlikely full repayment actually is for a man in his position. Halden Bishop Capital, for its part, absorbed the unrecovered loss as a write-down against the firm's balance sheet in the fiscal year following the case. A hit that, under Reyes Capital Group's now majority ownership, was managed carefully enough that it didn't trigger any client exodus beyond the 2 quarters of attrition I mentioned earlier. And the firm has, in the 18 months since, actually grown its assets under management by a figure that more than offset the original loss, partly because, as strange as it sounds, the case itself became something of a reputational asset for the firm. Clients, once the dust settled, tended to view a company that had not just detected but aggressively, publicly prosecuted its own executive-level fraud as more trustworthy going forward, not less, a counterintuitive outcome that Richard Halden has mentioned to me more than once in board meetings, usually with a small, rueful laugh about the strange arithmetic of institutional trust. I want to bring this back one more time to the theme that started this entire video, because I think it's worth stating clearly, without metaphor, exactly what I've learned. The people who underestimate you are not always cruel people. Vivian isn't a cartoon villain. She's a woman who inherited a set of assumptions about status and worth from her own upbringing and never once had a reason strong enough to question them, because nobody in her life had ever made her pay a real cost for holding on to them. Tyler isn't evil. He's a man who was never once, in 38 years, required by anyone in his family to build the kind of internal discipline that comes from actually needing to provide for yourself, and so he simply never developed it, the way a muscle never develops if it's never asked to bear weight. Chloe isn't malicious. She's someone who learned, correctly, that delegation dressed as leadership gets rewarded with applause in most rooms, because most rooms don't bother checking who actually paid for the catering. And Marcus isn't a monster in the simple, satisfying way true crime content sometimes wants its villains to be. He's a man who let a specific, ordinary insecurity about not being enough metastasize, slowly, over years, into a justification for stealing from the very people who trusted him. And I think the scariest part of watching it happen up close is understanding how gradual that process actually was. How many small, individually forgivable moments accumulated into something that, by the end, was completely unforgivable. None of that is an argument for letting any of them off the hook. Understanding why someone became who they became is not the same as excusing what they did with it. I understood exactly why Marcus built that shell company, and I still stood at that podium and made sure a federal agent walked him out in handcuffs in front of everyone who'd ever underestimated me alongside him. Both things are true at once. I think that's actually the most honest lesson I can offer you. You can hold a complete, nuanced, even compassionate understanding of the people who wronged you and still, without any contradiction at all, make absolutely certain they face the full weight of what they did. Compassion for someone's psychology is not the same as mercy for their consequences. And confusing the two is exactly how families like the Hales end up producing decade after decade of people who never learn. Because someone, somewhere, always intervenes to soften the landing before the lesson actually lands, before it has a chance to change anything at all. I want to describe one more scene before I bring this all the way to the present, because I think it's the moment that actually taught me the most about the difference between the family I married into and the one I was born into, and it happened almost by accident, 3 weeks after the sentencing, at my father's house, on an ordinary Sunday that wasn't supposed to be about any of this at all. I'd gone over for dinner, just the two of us, the way we did most Sundays by that point, and while he was finishing up in the kitchen, I wandered into his study, a room I'd spent countless hours in as a kid, doing homework at the corner desk while he worked late, and I found, sitting on top of a stack of papers on his desk, a folder labeled, in his handwriting, E. Contingency, dated almost exactly 5 months before I'd ever found that first $8,000 wire transfer to Hartwell. I opened it, and inside was a fully drafted, notarized document establishing an irrevocable trust in my name, funded at $11 million, structured specifically to be entirely separate from any marital assets, dated and signed nearly half a year before I had any conscious awareness that anything was wrong in my marriage at all. When he came in and saw me holding it, he didn't look embarrassed or caught, the way most people would. He just said simply, "I didn't know anything specific was wrong, Elena. I just watched how Marcus talked about money at your anniversary dinner that spring, and it didn't sit right with me. Fathers don't always need proof. Sometimes we just need a bad feeling and enough resources to act on it quietly, in case we're right." I sat down in the chair across from his desk and didn't say anything for a long time, because I think that folder, more than anything Marcus had done or the Hales had said over 9 years, was the clearest single piece of evidence I'd ever encountered of what it actually feels like to be protected by someone who takes your worth as a given fact, requiring no additional proof, rather than as a hypothesis that needs to be argued for at every single family dinner. That contingency trust, as it turned out, became one of the foundational pieces of capital I used, 8 months later, to fund the expansion of Reyes Forensic Advisory into the 14-person firm it is today. And I think there's something almost too neat, almost too symbolic, about the fact that the exact structure my father built quietly, out of nothing more than a bad feeling at an anniversary dinner, ended up being the literal financial engine behind my professional rise in the aftermath of the very marriage that bad feeling had correctly anticipated would eventually collapse. I don't share that story to suggest some kind of mystical foresight on his part. My father would be the first to tell you it wasn't foresight, it was simply pattern recognition built over 4 decades of watching people reveal themselves in small, unguarded moments, the exact same skill he'd spent my entire childhood quietly teaching me, one Sunday dinner at a time, long before either of us knew exactly what it would eventually be used for. I think about legacy differently now than I did before all of this happened. I used to think legacy meant the Hale name, the summer house in Newport Vivian talked about at every single family gathering, the specific, brittle performance of old money that required constant maintenance and constant audience approval to keep functioning. What I actually inherited, it turns out, wasn't a name at all. It was a method, patience without passivity, quiet without smallness, the specific discipline of gathering every piece of evidence before you ever say a single word out loud, and then, once you finally do speak, making absolutely certain the room understands exactly what you meant. I didn't inherit that from a wedding or a marriage or 9 years of trying to earn approval from a family that had already decided, on day one, what kind of woman I was allowed to be. I inherited it from a man who kept a 200,000-mile sedan and a contingency trust in the same desk drawer, and who taught me, without ever once making a speech about it, that the two things weren't actually in tension at all. I don't know exactly what's next for me professionally. There's a deal on the table right now, one I can't discuss the specifics of yet, that would roughly double the size of Reyes Forensic Advisory's institutional client base within 18 months. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't spending most of my working hours on it. I don't know exactly what's next for me personally either. And for the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm genuinely comfortable not knowing. Comfortable letting that particular answer arrive on its own schedule, in its own time, rather than forcing it into a shape that satisfies someone else's timeline for what a 35-year-old woman's life is supposed to look like. What I do know is this: the next time someone calls you just anything, just a side chick, just the quiet one, just the person who handles it, just a wife who does boring paperwork, I hope you remember that just is very often the exact word people use right before they find out how completely, catastrophically wrong they were. I've had a lot of people ask me, in messages and in comments under earlier stories I've shared, how to even begin building the kind of case I built, if they suspect something similar might be happening in their own lives, and I want to spend a few minutes actually answering that practically, because I think there's real value in it beyond just the satisfaction of the story itself, and because I built my entire career on the belief that information should actually help people, not just entertain them. The first thing I always tell people is this: do not confront before you document. I cannot stress this enough, and I watched enough of my own clients over the years learn this lesson the hard way, usually because someone found one suspicious charge, panicked, and confronted their partner that same night, only to watch every account get scrubbed clean and every password get changed within 48 hours, destroying evidence that might have taken months to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. Emotion tells you to confront immediately. Strategy tells you to document first and confront, if you confront at all, only once your position is completely secure. Those two instincts will feel, in the moment, like they're pulling you in opposite directions, and almost every time, the strategic instinct is the one that actually protects you. The second thing is to understand what you legally have access to versus what you don't, because this distinction matters enormously and gets people into real trouble if they blur it. As a joint account holder, I had every legal right to review our shared bank statements, our joint credit card records, our household budgeting software. Nothing about my initial discovery of the Hartwell wire required anything except paying close attention to information I was already fully entitled to see. Where it gets more complicated is anything requiring specialized access: subpoenaed bank records, badge swipe logs, hotel guest registries, and that's exactly why professionals like Renata exist. Because a private investigator or forensic accountant operating within proper legal channels can access and verify information that would be legally risky, or outright illegal, for an individual to try obtaining on their own through unauthorized means. I want to be very direct about this, because I think some people hear a story like mine and get the wrong idea. I never once accessed anything through hacking, through unauthorized surveillance, through anything that would have compromised the legal integrity of the case. Every single piece of evidence I used was gathered through channels that would hold up, and did hold up, in a federal courtroom, because sloppy or illegal evidence gathering doesn't just risk your own legal exposure, it can actually undermine an otherwise solid case by giving a defense attorney grounds to have key evidence excluded entirely. The third thing is to build your exit and your protection before you build your confrontation. I retained Diane Okafor and structured the legal insulation of my own assets months before Marcus ever knew anything was wrong. And I think that sequencing is the single most important piece of practical advice I can give anyone in a similar situation. It's not about planning to fail at the marriage, it's about understanding that once real evidence of serious wrongdoing exists, the legal and financial landscape around you shifts immediately and often unpredictably, and you want your own protections locked in before that shift happens, not scrambled together in a panic after it already has. The fourth thing, and this is the one people ask me about most, the one that made the biggest visible difference in how this story actually played out. Think carefully about timing and venue, not for drama's sake, but because the venue you choose to reveal a truth in actually shapes the consequences that follow it. If I had handled everything quietly, a private lawyer's letter, a discreet divorce filing, a confidential settlement with Halden Bishop's board, Marcus would likely still have faced some consequences, but the specific, public, unambiguous nature of what happened at that gala meant there was no room left for anyone in that family, or in that company, to quietly rewrite the story afterward, to soften it into something more palatable at future dinners, to let Vivian eventually tell some diminished version where Marcus made some mistakes, rather than the specific, documented truth of $13 million stolen using her own maiden name as an alias. Public truth is harder to erase than private truth, and I think, if you're building toward a moment like that yourself, it's worth asking honestly whether the people involved have a track record of quietly rewriting inconvenient realities once the immediate crisis passes. Because if they do, quiet resolution may end up costing you the very accountability you spent months working to secure. I'll leave you with this because I think it's the most important practical thing I can say. None of this required me to become someone I wasn't. I didn't become colder or crueler or fundamentally different in some dramatic personality transformation. I became more precisely myself, the version of me that had always existed underneath 9 years of politely absorbing other people's assumptions, the version my father had spent a lifetime quietly training, the version that knew, long before that gala, exactly how to build an unbreakable case out of boring documents and patient attention. The gala didn't create that woman, it just finally gave her a microphone. I want to tell you about the last conversation I had with Vivian because I think it closes something the earlier scenes only partially opened, and because it happened much more recently than everything else I've described. About 9 weeks ago, actually, at a small gallery opening Chloe had invited me to, one of those events where you don't expect to run into anyone from your old life and then suddenly, across a crowded room full of abstract sculpture and overpriced sparkling water, you do. Vivian looked smaller than I remembered, not physically exactly, though the two-bedroom condominium and the loss of the Greenwich house had clearly taken some visible toll, but smaller in the way she carried herself. The particular deflation of someone who spent 30 years performing a certainty about her own status that the world had finally, definitively stopped agreeing to perform along with her. She saw me before I saw her, and I watched her decide, in real time, whether to approach or retreat. And to her credit, she chose to approach, which is more than I honestly expected from her. "Elena," she said, and there was a long pause before she continued. Longer than any pause I'd ever heard from a woman who used to fill every available silence with a comment about someone's watch or someone's flexibility. "I've thought a great deal about what I said to you over the years. About the watch. About being flexible. I don't think I ever once asked you a real question about your work, did I? Not in 9 years." I told her she hadn't, because it was true, and because I'd decided, somewhere in the months since the gala, that I wasn't going to soften true things anymore, just to make a room more comfortable. She nodded slowly and said, "I think I assumed quiet women didn't have anything worth asking about. I'm sorry. I don't say that to undo anything. I know it doesn't undo anything." I told her I appreciated her saying it anyway, which I did, genuinely, though I also want to be honest with you that I didn't feel the kind of sweeping emotional release you might expect from a moment like that. I felt something quieter, more like closing a file than winning an argument. The simple, administrative satisfaction of a loose thread finally getting tied off. Nothing more dramatic than that. The way a case feels when the last exhibit is finally filed and stamped. We talked for another few minutes about nothing important, about the gallery, about Chloe's new job, and then she excused herself to find Tyler, who I could see across the room, in a suit that fit considerably better than the ones I remembered, talking animatedly to someone about what I assumed, given the venue, was probably his actual job now. The marketing agency position Douglas had helped him secure, and for a brief, strange second, watching him laugh at something across a crowded gallery, I felt something almost like hope for him. The specific, cautious hope you feel watching someone finally, belatedly, start building a version of self-sufficiency they should have built 15 years earlier, but better 15 years late than never. I drove home that night thinking about how strange it is that the family I once thought I'd lost entirely, in one catastrophic public evening, hadn't actually disappeared from my life at all. It had just rearranged itself into something smaller, more honest, and considerably less performative than what came before. I still see Chloe every few months. I exchanged a handful of civil words with Vivian at a gallery. Tyler, from what I understand, has been at the same job for 14 months now, which, for him, is a personal record worth acknowledging, even if nobody in that family would ever think to throw him a party for it. None of that undoes $13 million in fraud, or 9 months of an affair conducted in a stairwell timed down to the minute, or 9 years of being called flexible and little and just by people who never once bothered to ask what I actually did all day. But it does suggest something I didn't expect to learn from any of this. Exposure and consequence aren't the same thing as permanent severance. Sometimes tearing a family's illusions down completely is exactly what allows the honest, smaller version of that family to finally exist. Years too late, but not entirely too late to matter. I think if there's a single image I want you to leave this video holding on to, it's not the podium, and it's not the handcuffs, and it's not even the emerald dress, though I know that's the part everyone remembers first. It's the empty living room in my new townhouse, sitting on the floor with the light coming through the windows, completely alone, completely at peace, for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure. Everything that happened at that gala, the fraud, the affair, the federal agents, the entire architecture of a plan I spent 4 months building in silence, all of it existed, in the end, in service of getting me back to that specific, unremarkable, profoundly quiet moment. A woman, alone, in a home that belongs entirely to her, finally under no obligation to perform smallness for anyone ever again. I want to spend a little more time on Richard Halden and the mechanics of how the company itself actually rebuilt after all of this, because I think the corporate rebuilding process is a part of this story people underestimate, assuming that once the dramatic parts are over, the arrest, the trial, the sentencing, everything simply resolves itself. It doesn't. Institutions take considerably longer to heal than headlines suggest, and I spent a significant portion of the 18 months following the gala doing exactly that unglamorous, invisible work, not from a podium, but from a conference room on the 14th floor of Halden Bishop's headquarters, in meetings that never once made it into any of the press coverage of the case. The first thing we did within the initial month was a complete overhaul of the vendor approval process, closing the exact gaps Marcus had exploited, the ones he'd helped design himself years earlier. We implemented a dual signature requirement for any vendor payment exceeding $25,000, a threshold specifically calibrated below the level Marcus had operated at, because I know, professionally, that fraud tends to recalibrate itself just under whatever threshold currently exists, and I wasn't interested in building controls that would simply teach the next person exactly where the new line was. We brought in an outside auditing firm unaffiliated with either Reyes Capital Group or Halden Bishop's existing relationships to conduct quarterly, unannounced reviews for the first 2 years, a cost that Richard initially balked at, until I reminded him, gently, in a board meeting, exactly how much unannounced review might have saved the firm 18 months earlier if it had already been standard practice. We also had to rebuild something less tangible but arguably more important, the staff's trust in the firm's leadership generally, not just in the specific controls around fraud. I sat in on 4 separate all-staff meetings over the following 6 months, not to grandstand, but because I understood that 400 employees had just watched a colleague they respected. Marcus was, by every account, genuinely well-liked at the office, charming in exactly the way that made his fraud so difficult for anyone to suspect in the first place, get walked out in handcuffs in front of the entire senior team, and people needed a chance to ask real questions, in a room, to actual leadership, rather than simply absorbing whatever version of events the local business press was running that week. I remember one junior analyst, maybe 26 years old, asking me directly in one of those meetings whether she should be worried about her own manager, whether this meant everyone needed to start suspecting everyone else. I told her something I believe completely. The goal isn't universal suspicion, because a company that operates on universal suspicion collapses under its own paranoia just as surely as one that operates on universal blind trust. The goal is structural verification, systems that check themselves regardless of how much any individual is personally trusted, precisely so that trust and verification can coexist without either one undermining the other. Client retention in the 2 quarters immediately following the disclosure dropped by roughly 11%, concentrated almost entirely among clients who had worked directly with Marcus's book of business, which was, given the circumstances, both expected and manageable. What surprised even me was how quickly that number reversed. By the 4th quarter after the case closed, Halden Bishop's assets under management had not just recovered, but grown by nearly 18% compared to pre-scandal levels, driven largely by new institutional clients, specifically citing the firm's demonstrated willingness to aggressively investigate and prosecute its own executive-level misconduct as a reason for trusting it with their capital. There's a particular kind of counterintuitive lesson in that number, one I've come to genuinely believe rather than just observe from a distance. Institutions that hide their failures accumulate hidden risk indefinitely, while institutions that expose and correct their failures publicly, however painfully, tend to earn a durable kind of credibility that quiet, unexamined stability can never actually produce, because nobody watching from the outside can verify stability they've never seen tested. I don't say any of this to suggest the corporate rebuilding was easy, or that it fully erased the discomfort of walking those hallways for the first several months. Seeing Marcus's old office sitting empty, seeing people who'd worked alongside Brianna for years, still processing what they'd learned about her role in it. It wasn't easy. It was, like almost everything else in this story, simply methodical. The same discipline I'd applied to tracing Hartwell's wire transfers applied instead to rebuilding vendor controls. The same patience I'd applied to 4 months of quiet documentation applied instead to 4 all-staff meetings where I let a room full of understandably rattled employees ask me anything they needed to ask, however uncomfortable the question. I think that's actually the through line of this entire story, if I'm being fully honest with you. Everything that looked from the outside like a single dramatic act of exposure at a gala was actually just the most visible moment in a much longer, much quieter practice of paying close, patient attention to systems. Financial systems, familial systems, corporate systems, long enough to understand exactly where they were broken and exactly what it would take to fix them properly instead of just painting over the crack one more time. There's one final piece of this story I haven't told you yet, and I've saved it for last on purpose, because I think it's the detail that surprises people most when I share it. More than the podium, more than the trust document I found in my father's study, more than any of it. About 4 months after the sentencing, I received a letter, forwarded through my attorney's office rather than sent directly to me, from Marcus, from prison. I sat with it, unopened, on my kitchen counter for 6 days before I finally read it. Partly out of curiosity, partly, I think, because some quiet part of me still wanted to understand, even after everything, whether there was a version of an explanation that could make any of this make sense in a way the courtroom evidence hadn't already made clear. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, and I'm not going to read it to you word for word, because some things I've decided are mine to keep, but I'll tell you the shape of it. It wasn't an apology, not really, not in the way you'd expect. It spent the first page describing, almost clinically, the specific anxiety that had driven the whole scheme, the sense, which he traced back, in his own words, to a childhood spent watching his mother perform a wealth the family didn't actually have, that he would never be enough without some external proof of success, large enough to silence that particular inherited fear. The second page acknowledged plainly that none of that was an excuse, that plenty of people carry inherited anxieties without turning them into $13 million of federal wire fraud, and that he understood, finally, sitting in a cell, that the version of masculinity and success he'd spent his entire adult life chasing had never actually been real, had been, in his words, a ghost my mother taught me to worship before I was old enough to know any better. The third page was the part that actually surprised me. Not an ask for forgiveness, not a request to visit, just a single paragraph acknowledging that he understood, completely, why I'd chosen the podium instead of a quiet lawyer's letter, and that some part of him, even in the immediate, humiliated aftermath of that night, had recognized it as the single most honest thing anyone in either of our families had done in years. I didn't write back. I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you are hoping for a redemptive coda where the letter softens something, where I extend some final grace that closes the story on a note of reconciliation. That's not what happened, and I don't think it needed to happen for the story to actually be finished. I read the letter once, filed it in a folder in my home office, the same kind of folder I used to build the case against him in the first place. Except this one has exactly 1 document in it, and I haven't opened it since. I think there's a difference between understanding someone and needing to maintain a relationship with them, and I chose, deliberately, to let the letter exist as understanding, without requiring it to become anything more than that. I think that's actually the truest way I can end this for you. Not with a dramatic final confrontation, because the dramatic final confrontation already happened. On a Friday in October, under 22-foot ceilings and 3 original crystal chandeliers, in front of 471 witnesses who will very likely be telling this story at their own dinner parties for years. What actually ended it, the quiet, unglamorous, completely private final beat, was a woman alone in her kitchen, filing a 3-page letter into a folder she'll probably never open again, and going back to the actual, ordinary work of building a life entirely her own, unbothered by any name she used to be asked to shrink herself to fit inside. If you made it truly, honestly, all the way here, I'd genuinely love to know, Has there ever been a moment in your own life where you let someone call you just something, right before you proved, completely, exactly how wrong they were? Tell me in the comments because I read every single one of them every week without fail, and because I have a feeling some of you are sitting on your own version of this story right now, quietly building your own case, waiting for the right room, the right night, the right microphone, the right handful of federal agents walking calmly, unhurried, through the right set of double doors at exactly the right minute. I want to tell you about one more person who mattered enormously in all of this, and who I've barely mentioned. My assistant at the firm, a woman named Priya Nair, 29 years old, who joined Reyes Forensic Advisory 18 months before any of this started, and who, without ever being told the full scope of what I was working on, quietly rearranged my entire calendar for 4 straight months to protect the hours I needed for the Hartwell investigation, canceling client calls with vague, professional excuses, rescheduling board meetings, building a kind of protective scaffolding around my time that let me disappear into forensic work for 2, 3 hours at a stretch, without anyone at the firm asking pointed questions about what I was actually doing. I never explicitly told her what the case involved until after the gala, and when I finally did explain it to her, sitting in my office the Monday after, she just nodded, slowly, and said, "I figured it was something like that. You get a specific look when you're building something you're not ready to talk about yet. I've seen it on other clients' files. I just didn't expect to see it on yours." I gave her a substantial raise the following quarter and promoted her to senior case manager 6 months after that. Not out of guilt, but because I think competence deserves recognition, regardless of whether it happens loudly or quietly. And Priya's entire contribution to this case was, fittingly, almost entirely invisible to everyone except me. The kind of quiet, unglamorous diligence that never once shows up in a press clipping, but that, without it, none of the rest of this would have been possible to build in time. She still keeps a small, unlabeled folder on her own desk now, a habit she picked up after watching how I worked that case, containing nothing dramatic, just a running log of small inconsistencies she notices across client files, dates that don't quite line up, vendor names that repeat suspiciously across unrelated accounts. Because she told me once that the biggest thing she learned from those 4 months wasn't any specific forensic technique, it was the discipline of writing something down the moment it looks slightly wrong, before your own mind has a chance to talk you out of noticing it at all. And I think that single habit, more than any credential either of us holds, is probably the most transferable skill in this entire story. I also want to be honest about the toll this took on my physical health beyond the weight loss I mentioned earlier, because I think there's a tendency, in stories told after the fact, to smooth over the parts that don't fit a narrative of clean, controlled competence. I developed a stress-related eczema flare on both hands during the 3rd month of the investigation. Bad enough that I started wearing thin cotton gloves to bed, a detail so unglamorous it never once made it into any conversation I've had about this case until right now. I had 2 separate panic episodes, both at 2 in the morning, both while reviewing wire transfer documentation, where my chest tightened and my hands went numb, and I had to sit on my bathroom floor with the lights off, breathing slowly, until it passed, telling myself, in the specific clinical language I'd used to calm a rattled client, that a racing heart and numb hands were simply adrenaline metabolizing, not an actual medical emergency, a fact I knew intellectually and had to remind myself of anyway, at 2 in the morning, alone, because Marcus was asleep 11 feet away and I couldn't exactly explain what was happening without unraveling 4 months of careful silence. I'm telling you this not for sympathy, but because I think the version of this story that only shows the podium and the handcuffs and the emerald dress accidentally teaches the wrong lesson. That building a case like this is simply a matter of cold, effortless competence, when actually it required real physical cost, sustained over real time, by a real body that wasn't built to hold that much tension for that many months without eventually showing it somewhere. If you're in the middle of building something like this yourself right now, I want you to hear this clearly. The eczema, the panic on the bathroom floor, the 11 pounds, none of that means you're doing it wrong. It means you're a person, doing an extraordinarily difficult thing, and the difficulty showing up in your body doesn't disqualify you from finishing what you started. It just means you should build in actual support for yourself alongside the legal and financial support. Because I didn't do that well enough the first time, and I'm doing it considerably better this time, now that Ridgemont Capital Partners has entered the picture and I'm facing the possibility of walking back into that family's orbit for a second round. Actually, before I let you go, there's one more thing, something I haven't mentioned anywhere in this video yet, something I only found out myself 3 weeks ago, and I almost didn't include it because I'm still not entirely sure what to do with it. But I think you deserve the full picture, not just the parts that wrap up neatly. Renata called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying a particular flatness I'd learned over the years we worked together to recognize as her way of delivering something she considered serious. She'd been doing routine, unrelated work for a different client, a completely separate case involving a regional logistics company, when she came across a name in a set of ownership filings that stopped her cold. A minority stakeholder in a company called Ridgemont Capital Partners, filed 11 months ago, 3 months before the gala, listed under the name R. Okonkwo Bennett, not Hale, Bennett, Douglas Bennett's last name, Chloe's husband's last name, the same naming pattern Marcus had used for Hartwell, a childhood reference combined with a family surname. Except this time, it wasn't Marcus's childhood street and his mother's maiden name. It was, according to public filing records Renata pulled that same night, structured almost identically to the Hartwell scheme, down to the same Wilmington formation service, down to a similar pattern of vendor payments flowing in from a mid-sized regional firm where, as it turns out, Douglas has served as chief financial officer for the past 6 years. I haven't told Chloe yet. I haven't told anyone yet, actually, except my father, who, when I showed him the filing 3 days ago, went very quiet in exactly the way he did the first time I laid the Hartwell file out on his dining room table, and said only, "Elena, are you sure you want to open this again?" I don't have an answer for that yet, and I've noticed I keep opening the Ridgemont folder at exactly 11:40 at night, the same hour I used to open the Hartwell one, as though some part of my body remembers the schedule even when the rest of me is still pretending I haven't decided anything. I keep circling back to the fact that Chloe is the one member of that family who ever apologized to me without being forced into it by a courtroom or a federal indictment. The one who bought me coffee and asked real questions for the first time in 9 years. And some part of me is genuinely afraid that opening this new file means I'm about to hand her the exact same devastating Gala moment I once handed myself, except this time from the other side of the podium, watching someone I've actually come to respect a little have her entire life quietly dismantled in front of a room full of witnesses. And yet I already know, with the same cold certainty that carried me through the first 4 months of this exact process, that knowing and staying silent isn't actually a kindness I'm capable of extending twice. Not now, not after everything the first silence eventually cost me. Not after 4 months of eczema gloves and a bathroom floor at 2 in the morning and an emerald dress I still can't bring myself to wear again. All of it in service of a lesson I apparently still have to learn twice. Silence protects the people who least deserve protecting, and it always, eventually, sends the bill to someone who never signed up to pay it. I keep thinking about Chloe at that gallery opening, about the coffee we had 4 months after the gala, about her saying she was sorry for assuming I was simple, and I keep wondering whether I'm about to find out that her husband has been quietly building the exact same kind of shell company her own brother-in-law went to federal prison for, sitting 11 feet away from her at every family dinner for the past year, the same way Marcus sat 11 feet from me for 18 months while I said nothing. I'm not going to tell you what I've decided to do about it because honestly, as of tonight, I haven't fully decided yet. What I can tell you is that I already pulled the first 3 months of Ridgemont Capital Partners' wire transfer history this afternoon, out of pure professional habit, the same instinct that started all of this the first time, and the number on the very first transfer I found made my stomach drop in a way I genuinely wasn't prepared for. $340,000, routed exactly 11 days before Chloe and Douglas closed on a new lake house upstate that she'd posted about, twice, with a caption about how blessed they felt. Renata's already agreed to run the full trace, the same way she ran it the first time, starting with the Wilmington Formation Service and working outward through every linked account. And she told me something on the phone tonight, her voice low. The particular careful tone she uses whenever she already knows a finding is going to land hard on the person receiving it. Something I keep turning over. Elena, the pattern's almost identical, down to the naming convention, down to the same 48-hour lag between formation and the first inbound wire. Either Douglas learned this from watching Marcus's trial testimony a little too closely, or the two of them talked about it years ago, before any of it became public, and one just got caught first. I don't know which possibility unsettles me more. If Douglas built this independently, copying a method he watched destroy his brother-in-law in a federal courtroom, that's its own particular kind of arrogance. The belief that he could simply execute the same scheme more carefully, using a different formation service quirk here, a slightly larger buffer under the reporting threshold there, and avoid the same outcome that put Marcus in a federal facility in Pennsylvania for the next several years. If he and Marcus discussed something like this years ago, before either scheme existed, back when they were just two brothers-in-law getting along fine at Christmas dinners, then I have to seriously consider the possibility that Reyes Forensic Advisory didn't uncover an isolated case of one insecure man's fraud 18 months ago. I uncovered the first half of something considerably larger, something that's apparently still running, $340,000 at a time, financing lake houses and blessed Instagram captions, and, according to the second transfer Renata flagged this afternoon, a private school deposit for their 8-year-old daughter that landed in the account 4 days after that same lake house closing. While I sat at that gallery opening making careful, hopeful small talk about Tyler's new job and Vivian's smaller condominium, having absolutely no idea that a second version of the exact same story was already quietly unfolding 11 feet from where Chloe and I had coffee 4 months earlier. Comment below if you want the follow-up, because I have a feeling this one's going to be even harder to sit on quietly than the first time, and I don't know yet whether I'm ready to walk back into that family's orbit again, or whether some patterns just find you twice whether you're ready or not. And if you're new here, subscribe now because you've already sat through the last story with me, which means you've already proven you want to know how this kind of thing actually ends. And trust me, $340,000 was just the first transfer Renata found, not the last. And I already know, from 9 years of watching this exact family, that whatever number we land on when the tracing is finally done is going to be considerably larger than either of us is bracing for right now, and I already know, too, exactly which podium I'll be standing at when I finally say it out loud.